Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming. Chapters 701 through 710 of the previous episode. Chan Ping'an, thin and weary, continues his accounting work at Cyan Gorge Island while awaiting long-distance letters. Seeking to replenish his depleted Water Palace acupoint after his battle with Lu Laocheng, he receives rare medicinal pills from Lu Chongrun on Bejeweled Hairpin Island. He then purchases the soul vessel youth Zhengyi for 15 grain rain coins. Chan Ping'an takes the timid boy under his wing, patiently instructing him in secret soul techniques to prepare for salvaging Gukan's victims while maintaining his moral resolve. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 711. Seeing as fate had brought them together, Chan Ping'an wanted Zhengyi to be able to truly benefit from this deal and find a path to reach the middle 5 tiers and perhaps even greater heights. As the saying went, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. This was how Aoyang had nurtured him in the past, and he was willing to treat Zhengyi the same way because he cherished Zhengyi as a pure and kind-hearted young boy who hadn't yet been contaminated by the cesspool that was Bamboo Scroll Lake. These two secret techniques from Weibo definitely weren't of a low caliber, as Chan Ping'an had proclaimed. As for whether Zhengyi would truly be able to grasp the two secret techniques, that wasn't just a simple matter of whether he would be able to master them or not. How would he master them? How much effort and willpower would he have to give in the process? If he were to master them with ease, then would he be able to truly appreciate this massive opportunity that had fallen upon him? Over the course of his long cultivation journey, would he be able to look back and tell himself that everything he had achieved had been hard-fought fruits of his labors? Chan Ping'an didn't care what methods and philosophies other sects adopted in teaching their disciples, but when it came to his own disciples, he would only tolerate steady and solid progress, even if it proved to be a little slow. However, Chan Ping'an quickly came to realize just how difficult the task before him was going to be. The problem was that Zhengyi really was a complete idiot. When it came to cultivation, he had Lin Shui for comparison, while the one who had taught him martial arts had been Cui Chan's grandfather. From there, he had encountered the stunning prodigy Chao Ci on the Sword Chi Great Wall, who was the same age as him, yet had been able to easily defeat in 3 consecutive battles. Finally, there was his first-ever disciple, Pei Qian, for whom cultivating the 18 stops technique was like nothing more than a game, and that wasn't even to mention the likes of Lu Tai, Lu Qingshan. Even though Chan Ping'an had begun reflecting on himself and had learned the importance of not looking down on himself following his experiences in the Lotus Flower-blessed land, one's true nature was very difficult to alter, and he still couldn't help but feel a little down on himself from time to time. However, in the presence of the dim-witted Zhengyi, Chan Ping'an was beginning to feel like perhaps he had actually been a cultivation prodigy all along. No wonder that old Sword Immortal had told him that he would have possessed the makings of an Earth Immortal had his bonded porcelain and bridge of immortality not been broken. It was often the case that Chan Ping'an would have to meticulously explain a single sentence to Zhengyi over and over again, dissecting it into parts and explaining it from different angles, and even then, Zhengyi would still often fail to fully understand what he was reading. Back when Ningyao had taught him the quintessential elements of the mountain-shaking fist, Chan Ping'an had felt like he had understood her quite well, but when he actually began practicing his 6-step walking meditation, he was very unsteady on his feet and made a bit of a fool out of himself. However, he quickly began to grasp the ropes, but back then he didn't know how fortunate he had been. He didn't realize that the fist intent that pure martial artists so sorely desired was already flowing throughout his entire body, and even his fist intent hadn't been all that pronounced at the time. The fact that it existed at all meant that he had already crossed over a major hurdle in martial arts cultivation. Thankfully, Chan Ping'an had a very mild temper, so he was able to remain patient despite the snail's pace at which Zhengyi was progressing. There were 3 sheets of paper in total, and it was proving to be very difficult for Zhengyi to be able to get through just a single one in a day. Hence he felt very guilty. Every single day, feeling as if he were failing to live up to Chan Ping'an's expectations. Chan Ping'an didn't try to console him, and he certainly didn't try to lie to him and tell him that he actually possessed decent aptitude. Given the complexities of the world, it was very difficult to remain true to oneself. The more struggles and hardships that Zhengyi endured now, the stronger the foundation that he would establish, and only then would be able to develop the grit and resilience that would allow him to persevere when faced with true adversity. During his time on Cyan Gorge Island, Qian Ping'an had spent a great deal of time reflecting on the past, and in the process, he had reached many epiphanies that he had failed to even consider in the past. For example, Cui Qian's grandfather had told him that the purity of a pure martial artist didn't stem from their dedication to certain fist techniques. One could learn all of the fist techniques under the heavens, and that still wouldn't tarnish their purity as a martial artist. Instead, the basis of a martial artist's purity lay in their fist intent, and even more so their disposition. In the very early stages of Qian Ping'an's cultivation journey, he had been nothing more than a martial artist of the second or third tier. At that stage, the true test of his character would come when facing an opponent far more formidable than himself, one that he would have absolutely no chance against. Under those desperate circumstances, would he still dare to lead with his fist? Would he still be able to ensure that his fist intent didn't wane in the slightest? Would he be able to instead break through his limits and elevate his fist intent to an even higher degree of purity? In the face of a far more powerful opponent, one had to ensure that they didn't first defeat themselves. Only then would they have a chance of securing victory, no matter how slim. If one's fist intent began to waver, then even that slimmest of chances would be erased altogether. In that case, they may as well simply roll over and accept their fate. After 3 days and 3 nights, Zheng Yi had managed to develop a rather shaky grasp on the secret technique, and he officially began his cultivation. Only then did Qian Ping'an warn him not to try and bite off more than he could chew in the pursuit of speed. As long as Zheng Yi could remain faultless, Qian Ping'an was willing to wait, even if progress proved to be agonizingly slow. Once a mistake was made, it would take an enormous amount of time and immortal currency to rectify. Qian Ping'an's method for teaching him this lesson was very simple. Whenever Zheng Yi made a mistake by trying to rush things, thereby incurring spiritual damage that required the consumption of immortal pills to recover from, Qian Ping'an would purchase the pills for him, but all of the costs were recorded on Zheng Ye's tab, down to the very last snowflake coin. On this day, Zheng Yi was about to go into seclusion for the first time, and Qian Ping'an was standing at his door with a serious look on his face as he said, "You and I are business partners, so I will do my best to ensure a mutually beneficial relationship for both of us, and hopefully, we'll be able to part ways on amicable terms someday. However, don't ever forget that I'm not your master, and I'm certainly not your Dao guardian." Zheng Yi was rather fearful of Qian Ping'an's serious display, and he hurriedly nodded in response. Over the past 3 days that he had spent together, Qian Ping'an had been nothing but friendly and patient with him, and as a result, Zheng Yi had almost forgotten the crushing fear that he had felt during their first meeting. In contrast, it was his brief encounter with Gu Qin that still remained fresh and deeply ingrained in his mind, to the point that he had had a nightmare about Gu Qin one night. In his dream, Gu Qin had torn open his chest with his bare hands, then gouged out his heart and liver before devouring them with relish, following which he had licked his lips with a blissful expression. Zheng Yi was left to stare down blankly at his own bloody and exposed chest cavity, and after that, he snapped wide awake in a cold sweat with his heart pounding in his chest, and he was unable to calm down sufficiently to get back to sleep at all for the rest of that entire night. While Zheng Yi was cultivating the secret technique bestowed upon him by Qian Ping'an, the latter paid a visit to Moonhook Island and Jade Flagon Island to visit Yu Gui and the naturalist Cultivator. He paid for the fragmented souls and entities in their possession, then cast them in the Hall of the Underworld, a ghostly treasure that he had borrowed from the secret vault of Cyan Gorge Island. It was a miniature, arm-length pavilion crafted from a dark wooden material, and its interior was split up into 365 tiny rooms that made for perfect residences for spirits. Both Yu Gui and the naturalist had witnessed Qian Ping'an's battle against Lu Laoqing on Cyan Gorge Island, so they had given him a 20% discount on the total price. Of course, neither of the two wily old foxes made it clear to Qian Ping'an that they were giving him this discount because they were wary of his formidable combat prowess. As a seller, trying to increase the price to get more money out of the buyer's pocket was not an easy task, but there were countless excuses that they could use to offer the buyer a discount. Qian Ping'an naturally wasn't going to expose them, and he accepted the discounts with some words of gratitude. With that, they were able to get Qian Ping'an to owe them a favor, albeit a rather inconsequential one. While visiting the two islands, Qian Ping'an had put on his long untouched bamboo bookcase, which he used to hold the hall of the underworld. Yu Gui and the naturalist had naturally both noticed, but neither of them made any comment on the matter, and they pretended not to have seen anything. In their eyes, the fact that Qian Ping'an was still alive and well even after his battle against Lu Laoqing was a feat that was already worthy of admiration even from a nascent-tier cultivator. As for his inability to refine the hall of the underworld, that was clearly just an indication that his acupoints were in a rather shaky condition, and that was only to be expected in the wake of such a grueling battle. Once basic refinement was completed on an immortal artifact, it would be able to take on an insubstantial form and be stored in one's acupoint. This was not a difficult or complex technique to master, but the immortal artifact in question would take up an acupoint and constantly devour one's spiritual energy. The higher the caliber of the artifact, the more spiritual energy it would devour. This was why the gatekeeper at the Sword Chi Great Wall had taught Qian Ping'an an item refinement mantra when giving him that golden demon binding chain, and Qian Ping'an had managed to learn it very quickly. In addition to an item refinement mantra, the other factor that determined whether basic refinement could be successfully completed on an item was the caliber of the item itself. Generally speaking, an Earth Immortal wouldn't even be able to use a pseudo-celestial tool, let alone complete basic refinement on it. One of the reasons why the Fu clan had so much power and influence in Old Dragon City was the fact that its clan leader had full mastery over a pseudo-celestial weapon as an Earth Immortal. Hence what perplexed not just Yu Gui and the naturalist but also Lu Jimao and all of the cultivators of Gorge Island was how Qian Ping'an was able to use that sword that was, in all likelihood, a pseudo-celestial weapon. Despite his young age, he had a pseudo-celestial weapon immortal sword at his disposal. He was able to easily defeat a militarian cultivator in hand-to-hand combat, and he also possessed 2 bonded flying swords. All of this simply didn't make sense, and it was what allowed Qian Ping'an to preach his principles without being killed in Bamboo Scroll Lake. The difference was that if the average vagrant cultivator of Bamboo Scroll Lake were blessed with his gifts, then they would only become more unreasonable and less willing to preach to others. After all, being able to be unreasonable and not have to waste time with words was the whole point of attaining more power, was it not? Otherwise, what was the point? Why treat others with kindness when you could rule through fear? This was something that was never seen in Bamboo Scroll Lake, and over the course of generations, all of the cultivators in Bamboo Scroll Lake had grown accustomed to this reality. It seemed that the only exception to this was, ironically, Lu Laoqing, who was the most powerful native cultivator of Bamboo Scroll Lake. Unfortunately, Lu Laoqing wasn't even willing to grant an audience to any of the cultivators of Bamboo Scroll Lake. The only one who was able to set foot on Palace Willow Island was the Millet Grain Island master, and that was only because he was a spy for the Great Li Empire. Otherwise, he would have undoubtedly been denied an audience as well. After returning to Gorge Island, Qian Ping'an paid another visit to the Vermilion Cord residence. Over on Bejeweled Hairpin Island, he had learned about the tumultuous history between the 2 nations from Lu Chongrun, and as a result, he felt inclined to see the plaque hanging above the entrance of the Vermilion Cord residence through a different lens. Qian Ping'an rubbed his chin, thinking to himself that it was perhaps time to shave, unless he wanted to sport a thick beard like Su Yuanxia. Ma Yuanji appeared at the entrance of the manor and erupted into a furious tirade, telling Qian Ping'an to get out of his sight. Qian Ping'an didn't oblige. There were still things that had to be discussed. After venting his fury, Ma Yuanji finally stated the reason for his furious fit. The Willow Catkin Island report says that the most recent time that you visited Bejeweled Hairpin Island, you were surrounded by beautiful women who escorted you to the Treasure Light Pavilion to see Lu Chongrun. The report also says that Lu Chongrun has most likely taken a liking to you, and that there's a very good chance that you're going to become a guest elder of Bejeweled Hairpin Island someday. Qian Ping'an rolled his eyes in response. Is that really not the case? Ma Yuanji asked with a skeptical expression. Qian Ping'an offered no response. Ma Yuanji immediately put on a smile as he said, I knew the rumors were false. A gentleman of your lofty moral standards would never try to take Lu Chongrun from me. Please forgive me for my rude and unsightly display just now. Come and take a seat in my manor, Mr. Qian. As long as you can promise me that you'll never engage in any frivolous ties with Lu Chongrun for as long as you live, I can give you a half-price discount on our deal. I have no intention of stepping out of line with Island Master Lu, but what if she tries to pursue me? Chen Ping'an asked. Ma Yunji burst into laughter upon hearing this. You're a humorous man, Mr. Chen. How could Lu Chongrun possibly take a liking to you? So long as she remains sane, that would be impossible. However, he then lowered his voice as he continued. But if such a day really does come, then I implore you to please exercise the restraint required to turn her down. You need to display the virtues to be expected of a fine gentleman like yourself. As the saying goes, a close friend's wife must be left alone for life. While walking through the Vermilion Court residence with Ma Yuanji, Chen Ping'an was almost unable to suppress the urge to tell Ma Yuanji about what Lu Chongrun thought of him. It took him a great deal of effort to swallow his words, and in the end, he could only heave an internal sigh at the tragic story between the two, and the thought that he would have to return to Bejeweled Hairpin Island was one that instantly gave him a splitting headache. He could only assure Ma Yuanji that he would never try to seduce Lu Chongrun, nor did he have any romantic feelings for her. Ma Yuanji was very satisfied to hear this, and prior to taking a seat in the hall, he took a glance at Chen Ping'an then said, Back when you first came to Cyan Gorge Island, I was a little insecure, but in your current state, you're not much better looking than I am, so I don't have to worry about you at all. Thank you for your trust. Chen Ping'an replied in an exasperated manner as he removed the bamboo bookcase from his back before pulling out the Hall of the Underworld. Ma Yuanji's eyes were instantly glued to the Hall of the Underworld as soon as Chen Ping'an set it down onto the table, and he stared intently at it with an unblinking gaze as he said in a direct and candid fashion, I've been risking my life for Cyan Gorge Island for so many years, all in the hopes that I would be able to make sufficient contributions to the island someday to receive this treasure from the True Lord as compensation. Even in the worst-case scenario, I was prepared to save up money and buy it, even if I had to sell everything in my possession. A Hall of the Underworld is the most prized bonded treasure for us ghostly cultivators. And an Earth Immortal ghostly cultivator would be too embarrassed to even meet other fellow ghostly cultivators if they didn't have a Hall of the Underworld in their possession. Having said that, even Halls of the Underworld have different levels of quality. This is the most rudimentary type, and it's already quite a precious treasure. You see the lesser hell engraved on its bottom? I've heard that the most powerful nascent tier ghostly cultivator on our eastern treasured vile continent possesses a greater hell hall of the underworld, and it truly resembles a tall building, with 3,600 rooms inside. His soul can roam through it like taking a pleasant stroll, and it can enhance his cultivation base in the process. Perhaps I'll sell it to you when I leave Bamboo Scroll Lake, Chen Ping'an said. I was waiting for you to say exactly that, Ma Yuanji said with a bright smile. After issuing the payment, Chen Ping'an was led by Ma Yuanji to the well in the backyard of the Vermilion Court residence, and the latter instructed him to set the Hall of the Underworld down onto the ground. Ma Yuanji pulled out a soul-summoning banner, then began chanting an incantation while drawing upon his spiritual energy, and plumes of smoke began to billow out of the banner. Upon landing on the ground, the smoke transformed into a collection of entities, while deathly pale arms began to reach up over the lip of the well as more entities hoisted themselves out from within. It was clear that the well had an even more potent subjugative effect on entities, and even after they had emerged from the well, they were still in a daze for some time, making even standing up an extremely difficult task. Ma Yuanji didn't care about their condition, and he herded the ghostly beings together, following which they shrank down into the size of mustard seeds before entering the Hall of the Underworld. Chen Ping'an had already witnessed a similar sight on 2 past occasions with Yu Gui and the naturalist Cultivator, so it was one that he had grown accustomed to. As Chen Ping'an prepared to depart from the Vermilion Court residence, Ma Yuanji remained standing beside the well, and he suddenly asked, "What's the point in going to all of this trouble? You've expended so much time and effort without anything to show for it." "I've definitely already lost, but at the very least I'll be able to have some peace of mind," Chen Ping'an replied. "You did all of this just for peace of mind?" Ma Yuanji sneered. "Isn't this far too heavy a price to pay for something so trivial? The one who gives you peace of mind is Lu Chongrun. For her sake, you were even willing to sneak to the border of the luminous Vermilion Empire to kill those who had wronged her in the past, and in the end it even cost you your life, yet why don't I see you regretting your actions?" Chen Ping'an countered. Ma Yuanji had no response for this, but he was only silent for a moment before smiling as he said, "That's not the same thing. I did what I did in the hopes of improving my image in Lu Chongrun's eyes, and my ultimate objective is to have her become my Tao partner. I'll be satisfied even if I can only engage in some acts of physical intimacy with her a few times. After all, as a lowly imperial chef, the high and mighty princess has always been my lifelong pursuit. In contrast, what are you getting out of this? Our paths do not align, so there's no point in discussing this matter any further, Qian Ping'an replied with a smile. Ma Yuanji heaved a forlorn sigh. You and I are cut from the same cloth. We're both destined to be detested by women for our hideous looks. Make sure to come and visit my Vermilion Court residence from time to time. Whenever I see you, I feel a little better about myself. This time it was Qian Ping'an's turn to be rendered speechless, and he put on his bamboo bookcase before departing from the Vermilion Court residence. It was true that he wasn't particularly handsome, and he was also rather unkempt at the moment, but even so, he still couldn't be compared with Ma Yuanji in the looks department. Even if he were willing to make such a concession, his parents would be sure to vehemently disagree. After leaving the manor, a faint smile appeared on Qian Ping'an's face. At this point, Hong Su was no longer in the Vermilion Court residence. Lu Jimao had instructed his steward to bring Hong Su to his Hengbo residence to serve as a maidservant, and apparently, she was in a minor position of power, with close to 20 maidservants under her command. Ma Yuanji was quite perplexed by this arrangement, but he certainly didn't dare to turn down Lu Jimao over such a trivial matter. Qian Ping'an had paid her a visit once, and that was the first time that he had been to the Hengbo residence. At the time, Hong Su had been in a rather sour mood. Qian Ping'an knew that as an outsider from the Vermilion Court residence, she was like an unknown regional official that had suddenly been promoted to serve in the central government of the capital city. On top of that, she had also been given a minor administrative role, so she was bound to have been bullied and ostracized by her peers and her subordinates. However, Hong Su was still very happy that Qian Ping'an had come to visit her. Qian Ping'an turned down the steward's offer to take him on a tour of the Hengbo residence, instead asking Hong Su to take him on a tour in the steward's place, and only after that did he depart. Not long after that, Hong Su applied for 2 hours of leave with the steward, then left the Hengbo residence to go to the entrance of the island to see Qian Ping'an. However, the door to his room was tightly shut, so she had gone to the dock to wait for him, but ultimately, he didn't return in time, and she had to return to the Hengbo residence in a disappointed manner, unable to express her gratitude to him. Unbeknownst to her, Qian Ping'an had actually been sitting behind the desk in his room the entire time. He was naturally aware of the purpose of Hong Su's visit, but he knew that he couldn't become overly entangled with her in light of his status and the situation that she was currently in. During his visit on that day, Lu Jimao had intentionally brought up the open-collar ladies, which was something that Gu Qin had brought about. In Qian Ping'an's eyes, this was a rather snide and clumsy move, and in response, he made a remark on hearing about how Lu Jimao was very proficient when it came to brewing tea, serving as a subtle warning for him not to try any more funny business. Of course, Lu Jimao was able to read between the lines right away, and he no longer made any further attempts to try and drive a wedge between Qian Ping'an and Gu Qin. Qian Ping'an was aware that he was going to have to expend a great deal of mental effort to maintain a friendship in Bamboo Scroll Lake, and that having a genuine friend here was going to almost undoubtedly cost him in the future. However, he was also aware that having a friend like Hong Su on Cyan Gorge Island was very important for his mental state. It was like a trickling stream of water. It wasn't going to be anywhere near enough to replenish the parched river in his heart, but the difference between having the stream and not having it was one of night and day. In order to repay Gu Qin's mother, Qian Ping'an had done many things for her family, and that included attempting to secure water for them in the dead of night during droughts. He was never able to get any water under the watch of the much stronger young men on patrol at night, but so long as there was still some water left, there was still hope. No matter how vigilant those young men were, they were going to have to sleep or have lapses in concentrations eventually, and Qian Ping'an would pounce on such opportunities, rushing out of hiding to dig open the small dam of soil in the upstream direction of the water source, allowing the water to flow all the way down to the field of Gu Qin's family. He would run alongside the stream of flowing water all the way, then construct a small dam to guide the water into the field. The water level would slowly rise bit by bit, and once the dam was full, he would break open the dam to allow the water to flow downward. During those years, Gu Qin and his mother almost never had to worry about water, and they never had to get into altercations with the farmers in their neighborhood over water. Chen Ping'an never felt like he was doing this to repay them. Instead, he felt like it was simply something to be expected of him. There were many problems in this world that couldn't be resolved, but as long as one could make peace with oneself, then they would be able to live just fine, and perhaps life wouldn't even feel all that painful or arduous for them. On this day, Zhang Yi stumbled through the door with blood all over his face. Chen Ping'an was already standing outside the door, and he helped Zhang Yi back into the room to sit down by the table before pulling out a vial of pills. The pills weren't of a particularly high caliber, only a type of ordinary pills from the Cyan Gorge Island secret vault that cost a single lesser heat coin, and they were generally purchased in bulk by abode tier and sea observation tier cultivators, so they were certainly more than enough for a third-tier qi refiner like Zhang Yi. There would be no point in feeding a cultivator of the lower 5 tiers premium pills that contain too much spiritual energy, as they wouldn't be able to retain the spiritual energy and convert it into their own. Zhang Yi took a pill with a guilt-ridden look on his face, and he was on the verge of tears as he apologized. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen, I was too ambitious." Chen Ping'an waved a hand as he explained to Zhang Yi. "That's not the case. You weren't too ambitious today. Instead, this was simply a hurdle that you had no choice but to grit your teeth and overcome, and you simply failed on this occasion. Hence, I won't put these pills on your tab. You must know the difference between failure from biting off more than you can chew and failure from being excessively cautious for fear of failure. After learning the difference between the two, you must find the midpoint that serves as a perfect balance. Otherwise, whenever you encounter a bottleneck in your cultivation, you'll either approach it with too much aggression and ambition, or back down out of fear and timidity, both of which will impede your progress." "I'll be sure to keep that in mind, Mr. Chen," Zhang Yi promised with a smile as he wiped a hand over his face. "Make sure to think regularly and deeply about your cultivation," Chen Ping'an continued. "Otherwise, you'll continue to remain stagnant or make very slow progress. You've already conceded that you're not very bright, so you need to think even more than the average cultivator. There are many things that those who are smarter than you won't have to think about, but you have to make the extra effort if you want to be able to match them." Zhang Yi nodded in response. This was a very simple principle that he was able to understand just fine. Chen Ping'an removed the sword-nurturing gourd from his waist before taking a sip of wine, and after a brief hesitation he said, "Only after doing everything in your power to ensure that you've left no stone unturned will you be slightly entitled to complain about your situation." In the past, Chen Ping'an would have definitely said that complaining was unacceptable, even if every possible effort had already been made, but he wasn't going to say something like that in this situation. Chen Ping'an instructed Zhang Yi to focus on rest and recuperation, yet right as he was about to leave he suddenly turned to cast his gaze out the window. Zhang Yi followed his gaze outside, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. "Focus!" Chen Ping'an scolded in a stern manner, and Zhang Yi immediately closed his eyes. Chen Ping'an left the room and closed the door, and after some hesitation, he ultimately decided to return to his own room, as opposed to taking a stroll to the dock as he usually did to look at the scenery. Once inside, he pulled his Hall of the Underworld out of his bamboo bookcase, then tossed a series of snowflake coins into it. Immortal currency was referred to as such due to the purity of the spiritual energy that they contained, which wasn't inclined toward yin or yang, thereby making it usable for both cultivators and ghostly entities. Chen Ping'an sat down at his desk, then flipped open an accounts book that was filled exclusively with handwritten notes. He pulled out a water residence pill from Bejeweled Hairpin Island before swallowing it, then closed his eyes to meditate. As the burst of spiritual energy slowly flowed into his water palace, he opened his eyes and read through the names and basic information of the people on the first page of the accounts book once again. This page contained records on a total of 9 people. Chen Ping'an took a deep breath, then began to silently recite an incantation while joining his index and middle fingers to make a sword seal before pointing them at the Hall of the Underworld on the desk, issuing a ghostly order to summon the 9 incomplete yin entities. Talismans had been put up in the room, and a formation had also been set up, transforming the room into an underworld environment fit for ghostly entities to return to the world of the living. There were 3 talismans in total, one of which was the Cloud Water Residence Protection Talisman from the authentic Death Avoiding book, and at the center of its talismanic core was an inscription made by the Master of 3 Mountains and 9 Lords. The second talisman was the Cypress Locust talisman that was capable of subjugating or summoning ghostly entities in accordance with the wishes of the user. The final talisman was called the Peachwood Nail Talisman, and it had been given to him by the naturalist Cultivator from Jade Flagon Island. It had a suppressive effect on the vicious nature of entities, and allowed them to retain their sanity and lucidity. As for the formation that had been set up in the room for the purpose of nourishing entities in the world of the living, Qian Ping'an had learned it from Yu Gui. In order to set up the formation, Qian Ping'an had recruited the help of others in transporting a massive chunk of bluestone from the lakebed of Bamboo Scroll Lake to the shore, and he shaved it down to a bluestone slab, then engraved some runes upon it before embedding it into the ground to serve as a foundation for the formation. In addition to that, Soil of Fortune had been purchased for him by Cyan Gorge Island cultivators from other islands, and it had been buried in strategic points in the ground near the stone slab. With each name that Qian Ping'an called out, a entity would emerge from the hall of the underworld before standing on the bluestone slab, which took up half of the room. All 9 of these entities had come from the manors of the former chief guest elder of Cyan Gorge Island and Gu Kan's senior brother, and they included both servants and open-collar ladies. Earlier, Qian Ping'an had already used a ghostly secret technique to become the temporary owner of this hall of the underworld, and after that, he had informed all of the entities in every single room of the Hall of the Underworld of his name, his relationship to Gu Kan, the purpose of his stay on Cyan Gorge Island, and what he was planning to do. These were 9 people who had suffered horrible deaths before being tormented even in death as entities. They harbored a wide range of negative emotions, including anger, sorrow, despair, resentment, suspicion. With the 9 entities standing before him, Qian Ping'an asked, "Do you have any final wishes that you would like me to fulfill in your stead? Can be for yourself, for your loved ones, for your sect, anything. Tell me, and I'll do my best to satisfy you." In addition to the mountain of account books, Qian Ping'an's sword nurturing gourd was also sitting on his desk, as well as the 6 fox-skin beauty talismans meticulously crafted for him by the Sioux clan of Light Breeze City. These talismanic paper figures could house entities, and allow them to roam the world of the living in the form of the women drawn upon the talismans. Qian Ping'an paused momentarily, then continued, "If we trace everything back to their roots, I owe all of you because Gu Kan's catfish was gifted to him by me. That's why I've tracked down all of you to make amends. In a sense, it can also be said that I don't owe any of you anything because we are currently in Bamboo Scroll Lake. According to the teachings of Buddhism, there are some karmic ties between us, but not very significant ones. It's stated in Buddhist scriptures that all of one's suffering in this life can be attributed to events of their past life. If we go by the teachings of legalism, then there are no ties between us at all. The teachings of legalism state that as long as one removes oneself from the mortal world and focuses solely on their pursuit of the great Tao, then all ties with others will dissolve on their own. However, I don't think this is right, so I'll do my best to help you." The 9 entities remained silent. Regardless of what emotional and mental state they were in at the moment, as they gazed upon Qian Ping'an, they felt like the emotions that they could see in him were different from those of the entities around them. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing reflections of themselves. All of a sudden, an open-collar lady suddenly demanded in a furious manner, "I want you to kill yourself in repentance. Can you do that?" "Of course not." Qian Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. "Then why even bother putting on this act? You're nothing more than a phony," she sneered. "You deserve to die just like that scoundrel Gu Kan. Both of you should do this world a favor and die." Qian Ping'an looked at her. Qian Ping'an looked back at her in silence as the woman's face became twisted with intense resentment, and she rushed forward, trying to break out of the boundaries of the blue stone slab, only to be sent flying back with a dull thump as if she had crashed into an invisible wall. She then struggled to her feet and began clawing at the invisible barrier with a deranged look on her face as she screeched in fury, "Both of you deserve the worst fate that could possibly befall you. We're already dead, yet here you are, summoning us under a false pretense of kindness just so you can gloat in our faces. You deserve to die even more than Gu Kan." In the end, she collapsed to the ground and broke down into sobs. Qian Ping'an rose to his feet, and the other 18 entities on the bluestone slab instantly took a collective step back in fear and apprehension. He then made his way around his desk and crouched down outside the bluestone slab. The woman raised her head as she asked, I just want to live. Is that wrong? Not at all, Chen Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. He didn't ask me to pass on any message to you, Chen Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. He sat down with his legs crossed on the ground as he said, Your name is Bai Litzao, and your original name was Mai Meyer. You were a third-tier qi refiner who came from the Stonebrush Nation, and you had a marriage arranged for you from birth. When you were 14, you were discovered to possess an aptitude for cultivation by fishing room cultivators of Cyan Gorge Island, and they purchased you from your parents for 300 taels of silver. Your parents changed their minds at the last minute, demanding 300 more taels of silver, only to be killed by the fishing room cultivators right in front of you. Upon being taken to Cyan Gorge Island, you caught the eye of the island's chief guest elder, and were taken by him as an open-collar lady. You resented the name Bai Meyer, so you changed your name to Bai Litzao, spending 12 snowflake coins at the incense room for this purpose. In the end, you met your demise at the hands of the flood dragon under Gu Kan, and your body was left in a horrific state. You harbor intense resentment, and that's why your 3 immortal souls and 7 mortal forms were mostly preserved. After you died, you were abducted by Ma Yuanji of the Vermilion Court residence and thrown into his well to be made into a ghostly soldier. After that, I took you out of the well and put you into my hall of the underworld. The woman wiped the tears from her face as she yelled, You can do with me as you please, but I'll never rest until Gukin is dead. I will remember him for all of eternity. If you're so powerful, then why don't you just erase my soul from existence? That way, you won't have to bother with making amends. Chen Ping'an shook his head in response, then rose to his feet. Another younging entity who had once been an open-collar lady said in a timid manner, I want to remain in this world, even if it has to be as a Yin entity, but I don't want to have to be tormented anymore. Is that possible? Of course, Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. If you think of any wishes that you'd like me to fulfill for you, then feel free to tell me. An elated look appeared on her face, and she extended a grateful curtsy toward him. Another female Yin entity with a cold look on her face pointed at the hall of the underworld on the table as she said, I want to enter the cycle of reincarnation and no longer be held captive in something like that. Is that a wish you can fulfill? I can easily release you into the cycle of reincarnation, but I can't guarantee that you'll be reborn as a human in your next life, and I also can't ensure that you'll be able to enjoy a good life, Chen Ping'an replied. All I can do for you is hold a Taoist heavenly worship ceremony and a Buddhist liberation rite of water and land for you, and all of the other Yin souls who wish to be reincarnated as a means of accumulating good karma for you. On top of that, I'll also do some other things for the accumulation of good karma, such as setting kanji stalls in your name to help the people who have lost their homes in the war-torn Stonebrush Nation. There are many things that I can do for all of you who wish to be reincarnated. The woman was clearly taken aback to hear this, and she seemed to have changed her mind as she said, Can I think about it before I make my decision? Of course, Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. Do you know my name as well? The woman suddenly asked. I do, Chen Ping'an replied. I also know that you were the one who wrote all of the couplets that were put up in many insignificant places in the former manor. The manor has since been renamed the Spring Courtyard Mansion, and I tried to find some of your couplets, but all of them have been replaced. Tears began to stream down the woman's face. I'm sorry, Chen Ping'an said. The woman remained silent as she continued to weep. Among the other Yin entities was a very fearful middle-aged man who had once been a servant, and he had a habit of speaking to others in a hunched-over manner as a sign of respect. After taking some time to muster up some courage, he said in a trembling voice, Esteemed immortal, my name is Jia Gao. It doesn't matter if you don't know my name, and you certainly don't have to remember it. My wish is to be able to visit my parents' graves and offer up some incense. However, their graves are a little far away. They're in a small subsidiary nation of the luminous Vermilion Empire called the Spring Luster Nation. If you don't want to make the trip, then just forget about it. My only other wish is for you to hold the heavenly worship ceremony and liberation rite of water and land that you mentioned earlier to accumulate some good karma for us so I can enter the cycle of reincarnation. If you can do that, then I won't resent Gu Qin anymore. Chen Ping'an nodded as he replied, I know where you're from. I'll make a visit to the Spring Luster Nation, and I'll summon you once I'm there." Jia Gao instantly broke down into sobs of gratitude as he extended a deep bow and said, "Thank you, esteemed immortal. I'll have to trouble you to pay for my funeral then. Hopefully, I'll be able to repay you in my next life." Qian Pingyan turned around to pick up his sword nurturing gourd, then took a large swig of wine before asking, "Is that it? Is that all you want from me? This is already more than enough." Jia Gao hurriedly replied. All of a sudden, another malign entity stepped forward with a fawning smile on his face as he rubbed his hands together and said, "I don't wish to be reincarnated, and I wouldn't dare to trouble you to do all of those things to accumulate good karma for me. I only have a tiny little wish, and it won't cost you a single snowflake coin, nor will it trouble you at all. Your name is Zhao Shi, right? Go ahead and tell me what you would like." Qian Pingyan prompted in an expressionless manner. The man was once a steward of the Spring Courtyard Mansion, and he took a glance at the open-collar ladying entities beside him, then said, "My only wish is to be able to stay in your esteemed manor and have a few open-collar ladies under my command, just as I had when I was alive. Also, I want to be able to visit them and satisfy some of my innate male urges. Back when I was alive, I only dared to sneak a few glances at the open-collar ladies of the manor, and I didn't even dare to look at them for too long. So please grant me this wish, esteemed immortal. If not, then I won't be able to rest." The first open-collar lady to have spoken, the young woman by the name of Bai Litsao, turned to him with a cold sneer. Qian Pingyan nodded as he replied, "Sure, that can easily be arranged." "Thank you, esteemed immortal," Zhao Shi said in a grateful manner. Qian Pingyan didn't even have to flip through the accounts book on his desk as he said, "Zhao Shi, your clan has been residing on Cyan Gorge Island for generations, and you previously served as a steward of the Floral Lantern Residence. The Floral Lantern Residence provided you with food and lodging, as well as a wage. On top of that, you had around a dozen open-collar ladies under you, and you were also granted 2 chances to leave Bamboo Scroll Lake each year to go to the border of the Stonebrush Nation to search for disciples and servants for the Floral Lantern Residence. Your file in the incense room only contained records of a single thing that you did in your lifetime, and I suppose it was also your biggest achievement in life. You once had an altercation with a foreign female cultivator in Cloud Pagoda City, and using your connections and your status as a resident of Cyan Gorge Island, you convinced a local cultivator of Cloud Pagoda City to defile the woman to death before throwing her body into the lake." An awkward smile appeared on Zhao Shi's face upon hearing this, and before he had a chance to defend himself, Qian Pingyan stepped into the bluestone slab, then closed his hand around Zhao Shi's throat as he asked in a cold voice, "Do you think this is funny? I don't find it funny at all." Zhao Shi's soul instantly began to howl in agony with Qian Pingyan's fingers digging into his throat, and he frantically yelled, "Qian Pingyan, you two-faced, lying piece of scum! I curse you!" Qian Pingyan lifted Zhao Shi up into the air, not allowing him to utter another word as he said, "When did I lie? You're free to enter the cycle of reincarnation as you requested. As for whether you'll be able to do so after I destroy your soul, that's not something for me to worry about. By the way, do you still recall that woman's name?" "I do. Her name was Wei Qingyu." As soon as his voice trailed off, Zhao Shi's soul imploded into nothingness. Qian Pingyan stepped back out of the bluestone slab, then returned to his desk. As he turned back around, he discovered that a pair of entities, one male and one female, had fallen to their knees and were kowtowing incessantly as they begged for mercy. 2 hours later, Qian Pingyan emerged from his room. Zhang Yi was already standing outside, and upon catching sight of Qian Pingyan, he exclaimed in an ecstatic manner, "It's snowing, Mr. Qian. This is the first bit of major snowfall for our Bamboo Scroll Lake this year." He then quickly fell silent as a sheepish look appeared on his face. For a powerful cultivator like Qian Pingyan, surely a bit of snowfall was hardly a noteworthy spectacle. Qian Pingyan looked up upon hearing this. Qian Pingyan looked up into the sky with his hands clasped up their opposite sleeves. It really was snowing. It would be even colder once the snow melted, and the paths would become slick with mud. Even Zhang Yi, someone who had lived in Bamboo Scroll Lake for a long time, hadn't imagined that today's snow would be so heavy and last for so long. Such was the ferocity of the snow that it appeared as if Bamboo Scroll Lake were about to rise by an entire foot. Heavy snow was a good omen signifying bountiful harvests for the following year. This wasn't merely a saying in the mortal world, and it was also spoken by the tens of thousands of vagrant cultivators of Bamboo Scroll Lake. Rain, snow, and morning dew were regarded as water without root, and it was naturally the case that more of this water would be beneficial to the spiritual energy and water fortune of Bamboo Scroll Lake. Every single island wished that this heavy snow was falling on them. After all, what fell on them wouldn't be snowflakes, but rather piles upon piles of snowflake coins. In reality, many Earth immortals had already soared into the sky and cast all kinds of mystical abilities, using their powerful techniques to grab tangible benefits for their islands. The winter solstice was here, and according to the customs of Chan Pingin's hometown, the spring courtyard mansion wrapped some dumplings for this day. 2 days prior to the winter solstice, the small catfish was finally able to suppress its wounds and secretly return to shore. And today it was instructed by Gu Kan to head over to invite Chan Pingin to the spring courtyard mansion to enjoy some dumplings. While issuing this instruction, Gu Kan was busy making preparations with his mom in the kitchen. This was a kitchen that was bigger than the ancestral residences of Chan Pingin and Gu Kan added together. The small catfish was feeling very curious as it made its way over to Chan Pingin's place. Gu Kan had said that Chan Pingin might hand something over to it, so what might this item be? The small catfish was still slightly afraid of Chan Pingin. Back in Pond Water City, the small catfish had felt an innate sense of respect and fear toward Chan Pingin due to the fundamental nature of its great Tao. After Chan Pingin's battle with Lu Laocheng, and following Chan Pingin giving it the name Tan Shui, it felt even more afraid of the young man now. Tan Shui was sincerely happy that its owner was Gu Kan instead of Chan Pingin. It felt very thankful that Chan Pingin had given itself to Gu Kan back in the small town. Following the recent events, it now felt tense and uneasy around Chan Pingin. Tan Shui walked up to Chan Pingin's residence and lightly knocked on the door. Chan Pingin's hoarse voice traveled over from inside saying, "Come in, the door's not locked. Be careful not to damage the bluestone slabs underfoot." The small catfish opened the door, causing the chilly air summoned by the heavy snow to rush into the room. As a being who was innately fond of snow and cold weather, Tan Shui didn't notice anything amiss in the beginning. Upon seeing the extremely pale Chan Pingin start to cough as he sat behind the study table, the small catfish immediately understood the situation and closed the door. It made its way around the bluestone slab that was as large as the carpet in Gu Kan's study and timidly stood beside the table, saying, "Mr. Chan, Gu Kan told me to invite you to the spring courtyard mansion to enjoy some dumplings." Chan Pingin stopped writing and set his calligraphy brush down. There was a self-made bamboo container holding a copper charcoal basket in his lap, something that he used to stay warm. Using the hot charcoal to drive away the cold in his hands, Chan Pingin replied in an apologetic voice, "I'll have to pass. When you return, please pass on my apologies to Gu Kan and Auntie. If Mr. Chun is worried about the wind and snow outside, then Tan Shui can provide some minor assistance in this regard," the small catfish said in a soft and gentle voice. Chan Pingin shook his head and replied, "No, it's fine." Tan Shui still wanted to say something, yet she immediately decided against it when she saw the look in Chan Pingin's eyes. "Do you know why I chose the name Tan Shui for you?" Chan Pingin asked. The small catfish shook its head. "Ice and charcoal can't coexist in the same cauldron. This is a simple principle that even children understand, right?" Chan Pingin asked in a slow voice. Tan Shui nodded in agreement. "Since that's the case, then charcoal and snow being able to coexist and become attached to each other in the same cauldron is extremely special and praiseworthy. This is one of the reasons for your name," Chan Pingin explained. "In addition, there's also a more selfish reason. Every time I see you, I'm reminded of the fact that me giving you to Gu Kan was an act of delivering help in a time of great need. I was delivering charcoal during a heavy snowstorm. If..." Chan Pingin stopped speaking, raising a hand from beside the charcoal basket and grabbing an engraving knife from the table. This action caused the eyelashes of the severely wounded Tan Shui to involuntarily shudder. This was the case even though it was a powerful nascent tier cultivator. On the table were a bamboo scabbard and bamboo saber that Chan Pingin had only just finished making last night. He had initially wanted to ask Zheng Yi, someone who enjoyed the snowy scenery, to make a trip to Purple Bamboo Island and help him buy or ask for one length of bamboo. Upon further thought, however, Chan Pingin had felt that green bamboo was seemingly more pleasing to the eye. After all, Wearing a purple scabbard and purple saber by his waist would appear far too flashy. Since this was the case, Qian Ping'an had changed his mind and asked Zheng Yi to chop down any random stick of bamboo on Cyan Gorge Island and bring it back to him. Afterward, he had spent the night making the bamboo scabbard and bamboo saber. A lot of scrap bamboo was left, and Qian Ping'an had cut these into a pile of small bamboo slips, several of which were now resting on the table, blank and awaiting inscription. However, these bamboo slips were slightly different from those that were already inscribed with characters. Newly crafted using bamboo from Cyan Gorge Island, these bamboo slips were no longer uniform in size, with some being longer, some being shorter, some being thicker, and some being thinner. Qian Ping'an held up the engraving knife that he had obtained as a freebie from the shop in the capital of the Great Sui Nation, after which he retrieved the longest bamboo slip and lightly cut it apart from one end. There were now 2 bamboo slips of different lengths, and Qian Ping'an cut the longer one into many more sections. The gaps between the separated bamboo pieces were like numerous bamboo knots. The curling smoke in the small alley, the blazing sun above the fields, the space between the 2 ancestral residences in Clay Vase Alley, the extravagant spring courtyard mansion, and the lawless bamboo scroll lake. Tan Shui watched on, and it was at a complete loss regarding what Qian Ping'an was doing or what he was thinking about. However, this didn't stop it from feeling nervous and frightened. The small catfish was a descendant of true dragons, and it was able to remain calm and fearless even when it faced Lu Laocheng. Now, however, it was standing beside Qian Ping'an's study table like a little child who had done wrong and was waiting for punishment from its teacher. Qian Ping'an didn't look up and he simply stared at the hacked-up bamboo slip and said, "There's an old saying from my hometown. Lotus roots don't cross under bridges, and bamboo forests don't stretch across ditches. Have you heard this saying before?" Tan Shui hesitated for a moment before replying in a soft voice. "I was yet to gain sentience in the jewel's small world, and I only started to truly understand and remember things after I arrived at Cyan Gorge Island. Afterward, I heard Gu Kan's mother mention this in passing in the spring courtyard mansion." Qian Ping'an finally looked up, saying with a smile, "Your temperament is very similar to Gu Kan's. However, did you learn how to speak with hidden meaning from Auntie?" Tan Shui remained silent, with its eyelashes quivering in a pitiful manner. "I've already felt guilty on 2 separate occasions regarding my choices pertaining to Gu Kan," Qian Ping'an continued. "As for Auntie, my debts of gratitude have already been returned. So now the only individual who remains is you, small catfish." Tan Shui looked up, using its vertical golden eyes to stare intensely at the so-called bookkeeper, who was sitting behind the study table. There was surging killing intent inside the room, so strong that even the wind and snow outside started to howl in anger. It was indeed very frail right now, but was Qian Ping'an's condition any better? No, he was even more frail and sickly. When it came to matters pertaining to the great Tao or life and death, Tan Shui wouldn't show a shred of carelessness. Apart from these 2 matters, she could wholeheartedly serve Qian Ping'an and obey his every request, viewing him as half an owner and showing him utmost respect. In this regard, was she not the same as Gu Kan? The 2 of them possessed a strong natural affinity, both in temperament and in terms of their great Tao. Qian Ping'an coughed and flicked his wrist, placing a golden rope on the table and chuckling in ridicule. "What's this? Are you trying to frighten me? Then why don't you look at the fate of your kin?" Tan Shui immediately saw through the origin of the golden rope, causing its eyes to widen in fury and terror. The other vagrant cultivators in Bamboo Scroll Lake definitely wouldn't react with the same sense of fury and terror as the small catfish. To say nothing of Lu Jimao, a powerful nascent tier cultivator. Even golden core tier earth immortals like Yue wouldn't react. Qian Ping'an put down the engraving knife in his hand and picked up the demon binding chain crafted from the whisker of the nascent tier flood dragon from the flood dragon trench. He then stood up and made his way around the study table, slowly walking toward Tan Shui as he said, "Of course, it wasn't me who personally killed this elderly nascent tier flood dragon, and even the demon binding chain was crafted by someone else at Stalactite Mountain at the request of my friend. It was a great sword immortal who killed the elderly flood dragon, and it was another great sword immortal who requested someone craft the whisker into the demon binding chain. The elderly flood dragon ruled over a small world and was on the verge of advancing to the unpolished jade tier. Yet it ultimately suffered the fate of death. Gukin might not need to know this, but are you truly unaware as well? Are you unaware that Bamboo Scroll Lake is too small for you? Not only that, but it will only become smaller and smaller. Qian Ping'an stood in front of Tan Shui and continued, You help Gukan kill this person and kill that person, relishing the joy of slaughter and killing to your heart's content. What are you seeking? Of course, there exists a strong affinity and resonance between your great Tao and Gukan's great Tao, so you naturally won't bring harm to Gukan. However, apart from following your whims and misbehaving all the time, don't you also have the foolish dream of helping Gukan solidify his status and then helping Lu Jimao and Cyan Gorge Island conquer the entire Bamboo Scroll Lake? At that time you'll be better positioned to engulf half of Bamboo Scroll Lake's water fortune, using this as the capital for your huge gamble of trying to advance to the unpolished jade tier. Holding the demon-binding chain in one hand and viciously jabbing Tan Shui's forehead with the index finger of his other hand, Qian Ping'an exclaimed, The size of your bowl should limit how much rice you scoop. Do you not even understand such a simple principle? Are you not afraid of stuffing yourself to death? Fury spread across Tan Shui's face, with its entire body shaking as it yearned to lash out with its claw and rip the heart out from the sickly Qian Ping'an's chest. However, it didn't dare to act on its impulse. One of the most important reasons was the pseudo-celestial tool hanging on the wall right now. It naturally wasn't due to friendship or goodwill. In fact, the small catfish could vaguely detect a strange aura from Qian Ping'an at this moment, the aura of innate dominance. In the beginning, Tan Shui had mistakenly attributed this feeling to the fated opportunity of the Great Tao from all those years ago. Afterward, it had suddenly come to its senses one day and realized that this wasn't the case, at least not entirely. Because of Tan Shui's young age and lack of experience, she was far inferior to her kin when it came to these matters. Wu Yi, the founder of the Yellow Court Nation's Purple Sun residence, was only a golden core tier earth immortal. Yet she had managed to see through Qian Ping'an straight away, determining that he was surrounded by karma born from killing flood dragons. Wu Yi was also unable to understand or fathom why this karma was so concentrated, and the only person who might be able to piece together the approximate truth was her father, the 10,000-year-old flood dragon who was now acting as the deputy mountain master of Cloud Drape Mountain's Forest Deer Academy. However, it was a shame that he most definitely wouldn't reveal his speculations to his daughter. Qian Ping'an jabbed Tan Shui's forehead again and again, exclaiming, You don't even know how to become a smart villain, so how are you so confident that you'll be able to live a long life? Why don't you travel to the Sword Chi Great Wall to take a look? Just how many Earth Immortals Sword Immortals die in the battles that take place once every 100 years? Have you witnessed the sword skills of Wind Snow Temple's Wei Jin? Have you seen Aoyang being smashed back into the majestic world by the Taoist second disciple's punch? And have you seen Aoyang send the Taoist second disciple flying back into the heavenly world in response? Have you seen Sword Immortals will you annihilate the Flood Dragon Trench with a single sword strike? Have you seen Du Mao, an Ascension tier cultivator, and the most powerful immortal of the Parasol Leaf continent, meeting his end? Qian Ping'an retracted his finger, coughing non-stop as he said in a hoarse voice, No, you almost died after seeing just Lu Laocheng, an unpolished jade tier cultivator. Tan Shui gritted its teeth as its embarrassment transformed into fury. It didn't try to conceal the growing killing intent in its golden eyes. Qian Ping'an pursed his lips and looked intently at the so-called descendant of a true dragon that had enjoyed a smooth sailing journey so far. What is it that's made you and Gu can think that killing other people isn't wrong? Why do you feel like you can die without regrets if you're killed? Someone like Gu Ken, a flood dragon like you, and a seemingly shrewd person like Gu Ken's mother. If I were strangers with the three of you, then are you aware of what fate you would have suffered? Even though my cultivation base is lowly, and I didn't throw a single punch or unleash a single sword strike, I could have had the three of you die several times over simply by staying at Bamboo Scroll Lake for a few years and chatting over some tea and making some deals with Lu Jimao, Lu Laocheng, the island master of Millet Grain Island, and so on. Tan Shui smiled coldly and retorted, Then why don't you kill us? Why are you hesitating? The small catfish appeared to become very happy at this moment, smiling faintly as it continued. Being able to walk to where you are today, I know that you're much smarter than Gu Ken Qian Ping'an. It's not an exaggeration to say that you're extremely careful and meticulous, calculating every action you take and even going as far as to probe the most subtle human heart. However, what does this matter? Didn't your great Tao shatter anyway? Qian Ping'an, do you genuinely understand how Gu Ken felt that night? You said you vomited blood due to issues with cultivation, but do you truly think that Gu can bot your explanation? He might not be as smart as you, but he definitely isn't an idiot either. I'm at the nascent tier after all, so do you think I'm unable to see through the huge problem that your body is facing right now? However, Gukin is too kind-hearted, especially since he's still just a child. He didn't dare to ask about your situation. As for me, I was happy to remain silent. The weaker you are, the less I'll need to fear you. I've been proven correct. You were just strong enough to block Lu Laocheng, allowing me to survive while you suffered severe wounds. With you becoming weaker and me becoming relatively stronger, I can smack you to death with a single slap right now. It will be the same as smacking a measly ant to death, something that's not even worthy of becoming food after death. Qian Ping'an casually tossed the demon-binding chain onto the table, placing his palms together as he smiled and replied, "Now this is the way. Even I was feeling tired for you when you kept those words bottled up inside. You're truly not a good actor, while I was able to see through everything." In other words, both you and I were feeling mentally exhausted. Right now, both of us are standing on the same path. Tan Shui narrowed her eyes and said, "Stop trying to act so mysteriously." Tan Shui chuckled coldly and asked, "Qian Ping'an, you haven't gone crazy after interacting too much with those entities, have you? Perhaps you've fallen to heretical and demonic ways? So you decided to embrace it and become a demonic cultivator? What, you're filled with wild ambition and want to emulate the city lord of White Emperor City? And you want to start with Bamboo Scroll Lake? This isn't impossible seeing that the impressive Mr. Qian is acquainted with so many powerful figures. There's nothing you can't do if you seek their help. Meanwhile, I'm nothing more than a small catfish that appears insignificant in Mr. Chen's eyes. In fact, any one of those lofty figures behind the scenes can easily crush me to death with a single finger." Qian Ping'an smiled, genuinely thinking that these words were quite interesting. It provided him with another possibility regarding his understanding of matters. It allowed the path that they existed on to become much clearer than before. At the same time, his smile also dispelled some of the tense atmosphere in the room. Qian Ping'an gestured for Tan Shui to sit down. He then turned around and walked back to the study table. He exposed his back to the small catfish just like that. However, Tan Shui neither attacked nor walked forward, instead staying put as it said, "Since Mr. Qian is a scholar who likes to adhere to principles and speak reason, then let me also stand here and speak reason with you." Qian Ping'an sat back down, grabbing the charcoal basket to warm his hands. After rubbing his hands for a while and breathing warm air into his palms, Qian Ping'an said, "Let me tell you a small story. Soon after I left the Jewel Small World, I set off on a journey to the Great Sui Nation. Not long after I left Red Candle Town, I came across an elderly scholar when I was traveling on a ship. He also spoke up once, but he did so to stop me from speaking reason even though other people had done wrong first. I was never able to understand his actions, and this was a matter that weighed on my mind for a long time. Thanks to Bamboo Scroll Lake, I'm now finally able to understand his thought process. He wasn't necessarily correct, but he definitely wasn't as wrong as I initially imagined him to be. On the other hand, my actions back then could at most only be considered as not wrong. They weren't necessarily correct." Qian Ping'an smiled and extended a finger, drawing a circle in the air. In the cultivation world, drinking, committing crimes, or acting in a righteous manner can all be considered as actions befitting of the cultivation world. Causing violent bloodshed is also part of the cultivation world. The battlefield is a place where people kill each other, so heroically rushing to one's death is befitting of the battlefield, and defeating an army of 10,000 is also befitting of the battlefield. Likewise, so are heroic spirits and soldiers refusing to retreat from ancient battlefield ruins. When it comes to the imperial court, there are officials who bring benefits to both the nation and her people, doing their utmost to bring peace and prosperity. However, there are also those who destructively interfere and bring harm to the nation, with these officials being vicious beasts in human skin. Of course, an imperial court can also face periods of suspicion from the nation when the emperor is too young, and there are also times when empresses and concubines might listen to official discussions behind curtains. Someone once told me that in their hometown, the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, an individual gathered their friends to kill all of the soldiers in an area in order to rescue their father who had broken the law. This person was viewed as an extremely dutiful son, and he eventually rose to become a high-ranking official who was praised in the history books. Another person traveled hundreds of kilometers upon hearing news of his friend's death, and he personally massacred the entire family of his friend's enemy in a single night in an act of revenge. He fled the same night, and he was praised as a heroic individual who displayed friendship and chivalry. The authorities pursued him for hundreds of kilometers, yet everyone on the way lent the heroic man a helping hand. He was admired by countless people during his lifetime, and his story was even included in a collection of biographies of martial artists after his death. Qian Ping'an drew a bigger circle in the air, continuing, I also felt indifferent toward these matters in the beginning, and I felt like if I came across these kinds of people I would be throwing one punch too many if I killed them with 2 punches. Now, however, I've finally reached an understanding. Their actions were influenced by the customs and traditions of the entire world at those specific periods of time. They were influenced by the culmination of culture and knowledge. The culture and knowledge in those periods of time were like the embodiment of several clay vase alleys, red candle towns, and cloud pagoda cities colliding and fusing together. Thus, those 2 individuals were widely celebrated as being dutiful and chivalrous. It's just that things are ever-changing as the river of time continues to flow forward. If we lived during those periods, perhaps we would have also felt a sense of admiration toward those kinds of people. Forget about killing them in a single punch, I might have even cupped my fists and bowed in respect if I ever came across them. There was an old Taoist priest who schemed against me and tricked me the most in this regard. He only showed me a period of history spanning 300 years. And I dare say that this was a relatively slow period of time where the world was comparatively peaceful and whole. It was just enough time to witness a sufficient amount of matters, yet it wasn't enough time to do a whole lot more. If it were any shorter than 300 years, I wouldn't have been able to fathom the exquisite nature of the knowledge promoted by the old Taoist priest. If it were any longer, however, then we would have returned to a time where a certain old scholar's knowledge and scholarly lineage still existed in the world. Qian Ping'an appeared very afraid of the cold right now, with his shoulders hunched over and his hands not leaving the charcoal basket for a single second. He smiled faintly and continued, Whether it's you or Lu Jimao, I have to say that the 2 of you truly can't compare to that person and that so-called young Taoist priest. The gulf between the 2 of you and those immortals who genuinely stand atop the mountain peaks is even greater than the gulf between heaven and earth. Qian Ping'an looked up and nodded at Tan Shui with his chin, saying, Inside one's mind and conscience, there should be a patch that's most muddy and dirty. Regardless of how clean the water from the origin is, this patch is like a ditch that will soil the water. In this way, almost everyone will experience conflict in the depths of their minds while being completely unaware of it. Bamboo Scroll Lake is the best example of this, forming a juxtaposition to the carefree nature of the pure white continent during the battle between 3rd and 4th all those years ago. These 2 places reflect both sides of the extremes. What do you think? Perhaps you don't understand what I'm talking about? Then let me talk about some things that you'll just manage to understand. When coming across conflicts pertaining to right and wrong, it's often the case that outsiders will support the weaker party without making an effort to fully understand the situation first. They'll feel a natural sense of dislike toward the stronger party, hoping dearly that they'll fall from their lofty pedestal. In fact, the outsiders might even criticize good people, hoping dearly that a moral sage will crack and show flaws. At the same time, they'll also revere the occasional good deed done by sinister people. The reason behind this phenomenon isn't complicated. This is a case of people fighting for that slim singularity, hoping to achieve equilibrium and prevent a small group of people from owning too much. This is already largely unrelated to the notion of good or bad. Taking things a step further, this is actually beneficial to all of us in the sense that we can more fairly distribute that larger singularity. No one can rise too high and walk too far, and no one will be forced to remain too low. It's as if we're all grasshoppers tied to the same rope. Those that are larger will jump higher and further, while those that are weaker will in turn be dragged forward. Even if the path forward is rugged and bumpy, causing the latter to become battered and bruised, they can at least keep up with everyone else and not be abandoned. They can seek warmth from the rest of the group, and they can also avoid the fate of being easily picked off by the birds. This is why so many people in the world like to speak reason, yet they'll still feel secretly happy even when those around them aren't in the right. This is caused by the patch of impurity in one's mind. When the world transforms into a state where more and more sacrifices are required to speak reason, then not speaking reason becomes the fundamental currency some people use to settle down and live. The latter attach themselves to stronger individuals, thereby allowing them to fight for more tangible benefits. This is a case of helping friends and not helping reason. It's because of this that Gu Kan's mother feels safer when staying with Gu Kan and Yu. In fact, she feels safer even when she's with Lu Jimao. The same reason applies. This is not to say that she's especially wrong regarding this matter. However, the extension of the path that was initially not incorrect is like the chaotic growth of lotus roots and bamboo, eventually resulting in all kinds of inevitable clashes with the established rules. However, Yu and Gu Kan don't care about these small details at all. The two of you simply want to smash through the bridges and fill in the ditches. This is the reason why I said to Gu Kan that all of the innocent people he's killed are actually many copies of the young Chun Ping'an and Gu Kan from Clay Vase Alley. Even then, he was still unable to accept my words. I've done many things here, and there'll eventually come a day when everything comes to light. I want Gu Kan to open his eyes wide and take a good look around himself. So be it if he refuses to listen to reason. With me, Chun Ping'an, present, I'm not only helping him rectify his mistakes, but I'm more importantly helping myself rectify my mistakes. In addition to this, I also want to have him understand some principles that aren't expounded in the books. In at most 2 years, when a certain cultivator climbs to a high-ranking position in Bamboo Scroll Lake, they won't need to rely on wantonly killing innocent people to build a commanding image. At that time, I'll still manage to enjoy a higher status and live a more stable life than Gu Kan. Tan Shui wanted to speak, yet it couldn't help but hesitate. Chun Ping'an smiled and asked, "What's wrong? Do you want to accuse me of having too many powerful acquaintances and too many immortal treasures again? So much so that you and Gu Kan can't compare to me? Then have you considered the fact that I managed to grab these relationships and treasures with my own 2 hands? The two of you won't understand even if I explain everything word by word. This is because you understand the principles, yet you're unable to act on them no matter what. Don't you find this very interesting? When your mind was developing, much like the stage when pottery is still malleable, there was no one beside you to properly educate you and guide you. However, this isn't important. Even if such a person did exist, I dare say that they would have simply been wasting their breath. In any case, saying these things won't improve the current situation. The most important thing is that you and Gu Kan don't even know how to become slightly smarter bad people. In this way, you're even more unwilling and oblivious as to how to become slightly smarter good people. The small catfish bit its lips and remained silent for a short moment. When it opened its mouth again, the first words it spat were, "Chun Ping'an, don't force me to kill you today." Chun Ping'an cocked his head slightly and asked with a smile, "Why do you want to kill me? If you kill me, then won't you, Gu Kan, and the Spring Courtyard Mansion lose a powerful backer? See, I just called you stupid even when doing wrong, and you were still trying to deny it." There was a slight screeching sound from the soles of Tan Shui's boots rubbing against the floor. Chun Ping'an chose to ignore this, instead pointing to next door where the young boy, Zheng Yi, was staying. The person living over there is a good person. He's also quite young, and he's also a slow learner to boot. However, I still hope that he can continue to live a good life in Bamboo Scroll Lake as a good person. This naturally won't be easy, but there's at least some hope. Of course, if I eventually discover that I'm unable to positively change him, or if I discover that my so-called schemes and plots, as you put it, are unable to guarantee his survival, then I'll step back and allow him to live as he pleases. Zheng Yi can rely on his own strengths to fend for himself in Bamboo Scroll Lake. Taking into account the fine details, there was once a time when Chun Ping'an had picked up his stool and walked back inside. Zheng Yi had remained completely oblivious, and he had forgotten to pick up his own stool when returning inside. Perhaps this could be attributed to Zheng Yi being a young boy who was inexperienced in worldly matters. He was still naive and simple, so he was unable to pick up on these fine details. However, Zheng Yi had actually become distracted and followed Chun Ping'an's gaze to look outside the window even when he was supposed to be cultivating. This caused Chun Ping'an to feel slightly exasperated and helpless. However, this could also be attributed to Zheng Yi being young, inexperienced, and lacking in opportunities to temper himself. Thus, Chun Ping'an could still wait for Zheng Yi to grow up and mature. making sure that each move he made on the Go board was slow but not incorrect. He didn't need to think too much about victory or defeat, and he simply needed to focus on the task at hand to increase his chance at victory. But what if the heavens insisted on killing someone? That would be fate, and just like Qian Ping'an had said to Zhang Yi, he only needed to care about maintaining a clear conscience at that time. Of course, he could also grumble at the heavens. However, there was one matter that made Qian Ping'an sigh with emotion. Once he noticed roots taking place, he was forced to make things clear and subtly warn the young boy who was developing stray thoughts. Qian Ping'an bluntly told Zhang Yi that the relationship between them was only transactional. They weren't master and disciple, and he wasn't Zhang Ye's Dao mentor or Dao guardian. It would definitely be incorrect to claim that Zhang Yi had a poor disposition, especially since the reality was the complete opposite. After facing life and death struggles, he still didn't forget about his master in Thatch Moon Island. This was one of the main reasons why Qian Ping'an was willing to leave Zhang Yi by his side. In fact, this reason was equally as important as Zhang Ye's cultivation talent and aptitude for the Tao of Ghosts. Zhang Yi was a young boy from Bamboo Scroll Lake, who allowed Qian Ping'an to vaguely see a shadow of his past self. Even so, this was a shadow that was unable to withstand any serious scrutiny. Zhang Ye's character appeared to be the exact opposite of Gu Kan, and his words and actions were initially the basis for the fourth path that Qian Ping'an wanted to carefully examine. After reaching this point in his plan, however, Qian Ping'an ultimately decided to go against his original intentions. He hoped that Zhang Yi wouldn't stray onto the wrong path, and he hoped to find a stable equilibrium for the mind between the two extremes of the ruler, one extreme named fight for it myself, and one extreme named receive it from others. In any case, this didn't matter too much. Even though Qian Ping'an did interfere and slightly change the course of the path still remained just that. It was merely heading in a slightly different direction. It could still be traveled and observed, and it was simply a little different from Qian Ping'an's initial expectations. In contrast to Tan Shui's bloody path, which would most likely continue unperturbed, Zhang Ye's path and young life were still brimming with countless possibilities. He still had the opportunity to walk along the right path. As for whether the pond in Zhang Ye's mind would flow from an area of purity and kindness to an area of extremity and hostility if he encountered some disaster or catastrophe someday, Qian Ping'an wouldn't force him onto a certain path no matter the situation. Zhang Yi was free within the regulations, and he would face the consequences of his own actions. This was only right. Human power had its limit, and even Qian Ping'an had conceded defeat regarding Gu Kan's situation. He was only able to make relatively thorough delineations and severances with Gu Kan under the condition that he stopped the wanton killings and wanton wrongdoings. It was only under these conditions that he could start to do some things for himself. What would the addition of Zhang Yi change? Qian Ping'an appeared slightly adrift at this moment. Many years ago in the Jewel's small world, he had only been a young bumpkin wearing straw sandals as he stood behind the makeshift gate of the small town. Standing outside the gate had been Kai Jinjian, Funanhua, Light Breeze City Su Clan, Sun-Scorch Mountain's mountain-moving ape, and the little girl who had hollered about carrying Cloud Drape Mountain back home to use as her small garden. That was the first time Qian Ping'an had interacted with travelers from outside the small town. Moreover, all of them had been cultivators from the mountains, individuals who were viewed as immortals by the common people. Fortunately, there was a young girl among the outsiders who had said that the Great Tao shouldn't be so narrow. After Qian Ping'an arrived at Bamboo Scroll Lake, his understanding of good and evil was brutally challenged and left completely bloodied, and it was only afterward that he discovered a large number of flaws in his mind. As it turned out, he was so precariously fragile. For example, it was important for Qian Ping'an to recognize the fact that he was also an immortal from the mountains now, or at least half an immortal from the mountains. Otherwise, if he denied this fact and rejected his own identity simply because of the mountain-moving ape's existence, then this would inevitably manifest as a flaw in his great Tao. If he truly set foot on the Golden Bridge, it would definitely collapse and send him plummeting into the river. Qian Ping'an sighed and mused. I turned my back to you once, and I also became lost in thought just now. I've already given you 2 opportunities, small catfish, but you still don't dare to kill me. Tan Shui's voice was cold as she replied. Isn't everything going according to your plans? Based on what you've said, the regulations are omnipresent, and there's every possibility that you've hidden your regulations here. Perhaps you secretly set up a hidden formation. Or perhaps your regulations are contained within this demon-binding chain that can innately suppress me. Everything is possible. In any case, you also said it yourself. How will it benefit me to kill you? I would lose a backer and a powerful shield for no benefit in return. Qian Ping'an smiled and asked, "Can this be regarded as my reasons getting through to you?" Tan Shue's face was filled with ridicule as she responded. "And are you going to say that people like me only pick and choose the reasons that we want to adhere to?" Qian Ping'an lightly shook his head. There was a fake smile on Tan Shue's face as she said sarcastically, "What lesson does Mr. Qian have for me now?" Tan Shui will listen with full attention. "You're not a human, and you're instead only a lowly beast," Qian Ping'an said. "If I knew that things would turn out, then I wouldn't have given you to the snotty little kid back in the Jewel Small world. I would have cooked you into a dish and enjoyed a hearty meal. That would have spared me from all this headache and debts to other people." Tan Shui smiled faintly and replied, "I refuse to become angry, and I insist on going against your expectations. I won't give you the opportunity to perform delineations and severances against me." Qian Ping'an clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "Wow, you're showing signs of growth. However, aren't you suspicious about whether I'm bluffing right now?" Tan Shui shook her head and replied, "We've already had an open and honest discussion with each other, and I was able to benefit greatly from the conversation. There's also one thing that I've learned today. Mr. Qian is conducting himself as a good person and performing good deeds for the sake of himself. I definitely can't bring myself to do these things. However, I can obediently stay by your side and refrain from committing any more crimes. I won't give you a single excuse to target me. Won't that make you feel even more disgusted and repulsed? You're clearly very smart, Mr. Qian, but you also like to adhere to rules and speak reason with other people. If you kill me, Gu Kan's great Tao will suffer severe damage, and his bridge of immortality will undoubtedly shatter as well. He isn't as tough and tenacious as you are. He won't be able to pick himself back up in a slow and steady manner, and it's very likely that he'll end up a useless and crippled person. Can Mr. Qian truly bear to do this?" Qian Ping'an nodded and concurred. "That's indeed the case. How can the snotty little brat compare to me? He doesn't know what kind of person his mother truly is. He doesn't understand how a beast with a connected great Tao to him is thinking. He isn't aware of how Lu Jimao is controlling people beyond his ruthless iron rule. He doesn't know how to truly win over Lu Kaisang. And he isn't even willing to spend a tiny bit of time to mull over whether the stupid Fan Yan is truly stupid or not. In fact, he's showing absolutely no concern or thought about the most catastrophic possibility. How can such a Gu Kan compare to me? He might be young right now, but he still won't ponder these issues even if he's given another 10 or 20 years in Bamboo Scroll Lake." Qian Ping'an was extremely calm and nonchalant as he spoke these words. He leaned back into his chair, his hands warm and cozy as he continued. "The world is extremely strange in this way. I killed an eel demon, yet I was actually riddled with bad karma as a result. On the other hand, Gu Kan has killed so many innocent people in Bamboo Scroll Lake, yet he surprisingly managed to kill some people who truly deserve death. Of course, this was only a very small number of people, but disregarding some significant karmic consequences, he's actually managed to increase his good karma. I truly don't know whether to laugh or to cry about the strange place that is Bamboo Scroll Lake. If I don't target the mortals and only target the vagrant cultivators, perhaps my good karma will at least cancel out my bad karma even if I massacre every single one of them. Of course, I don't dare to say this with certainty, and it's nothing more than a speculation that I came up with when I was bored. Didn't know whether to laugh or to cry." This was a saying that Bamboo Scroll Lake could continue to ruminate over again and again. This went for both living people and dead people. Tan Shui maintained the smile on its face as it replied, "I'm not Mr. Qian, so I couldn't care less about these messy problems. As for insulting me and calling me a beast, you're free to do so as long as it makes you happy. After all, I am indeed a beast." A brilliant smile spread across Qian Ping'an's face and he said, "In the past, I never thought that I was a good person, not when I was still in my hometown, and not even when I embarked on 2 long journeys. Even though 2 people who were very important to me both called me a foolishly kind person, I still refused to believe this was the case. After arriving at the godforsaken Bamboo Scroll Lake, however, I feel like I've almost become a sage of morality. To hell with the state of this place, and to hell with the rules of Bamboo Scroll Lake." Have the people here become addicted to eating shit? The young bookkeeper spoke slowly, and even though he was asking a question, his tone almost didn't fluctuate at all. It was as if he were simply telling a small joke. Tan Shui covered her mouth and giggled, saying, "If Mr. Chun is so capable, then why don't you repeat this to Gu Kan? I'm deaf to your reasons, and they'll go in one ear and come out the other. Gu Kan's mind is unstable right now, so why doesn't Mr. Chun pick a sunny day after a bout of snow to sit down on some small bamboo chairs with the snotty little kid? You can speak and he can listen, just like what took place at the dinner table that day. Gu Kan is most likely willing to listen to your reasons now. Even though he might not take them seriously, he'll at least be willing to sit down and listen." Chun Ping'an nodded and replied, "I'll consider this. We've chatted for quite a while now, so have you forgotten what we were discussing in the beginning?" Tan Shui nodded and said with a smile, "It's the winter solstice today, so I've come to invite Mr. Chun to eat dumplings with Gu Kan and his mother." Chun Ping'an also nodded again, replying, "And as for me, I promised Gu Kan that I would give you one thing. Here, take it." It was the jade tablet with the words, "Nourishing the noble spirit." Tan Shui frowned upon seeing this. Something tugged at its mind, and it didn't reach over to accept the jade tablet. Instead, there was a puzzled expression on Tan Shui's face as it allowed the jade tablet to hang in front of its body. The small catfish's heart suddenly jolted, and sure enough, subtle changes started to take place on the bluestone slab on the floor. Not only that, but the demon-binding chain also disappeared from the table in a flash, rapidly wrapping around its waist. Tan Shui chuckled coldly in response. However, it felt as if it had been plunged into a glacial pit in the very next moment. Tan Shui looked down before looking back up. An extremely thin golden thread extended from the opposite wall all the way to its chest, with a peerlessly sharp pseudo-celestial tool now stabbed through its body. Chun Ping'an retrieved a porcelain vial and poured out a secret alchemical pill from the water palace, swallowing it in a single gulp before lightly placing the vial on the table. He raised a finger to his lip and signaled for Tan Shui to be quiet, after which he warned, "I suggest you stay silent. Otherwise, you'll die straight away." Tan Shui didn't dare to move at all. A pseudo-celestial tool was pierced through her heart right now, and even a nascent tier cultivator at the peak of their powers would suffer severe wounds if they took such a hit. Chun Ping'an was completely unfazed by Tan Shui's pitiful state, and he silently digested the alchemical pill and absorbed its spiritual energy before saying in a slow voice, "Today is the winter solstice, and according to the customs of my hometown, families should gather together to enjoy a meal of dumplings. I spoke to Gu Kan before, and I also calculated the approximate recovery speed of nascent tier flood dragons like you. At the same time, I've also been keeping an eye on Gu Kan's physical state. With these pieces of information, I determined when you would return to shore. I also remember the approximate dinner time of the spring courtyard mansion, and I additionally considered the fact that you most likely wouldn't be willing to show yourself in front of the cultivators of Cyan Gorge Island. As such, you would potentially use the mystical ability of earth immortals to come here and knock on my door. With this in mind, I took action at just the right time, ingesting 3 chi replenishing pills about 15 minutes before you arrived. As for you, you don't understand my true abilities, and you're instead relying on your cultivation base as a nascent tier cultivator. You're even more unwilling to carefully investigate my bonded water palace, so you were completely oblivious to the fact that I can now manipulate Sword Immortal to the peak of my capability. Of course, this requires some slightly larger sacrifices, but no matter, everything is worth it. For example, I was only scaring you just then when I told you that you would die straight away if you dared to move. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had enough time to replenish my spiritual energy. Right now, however, you'll truly die straight away if you dare to move." Chun Ping'an stood up and walked around the study table, waving his hand and causing the jade tablet to fly up from the floor and into his palm. He grabbed the jade tablet lightly, and it was as if he were completely unafraid of Tan Shui putting up a last-ditch struggle and launching a vicious counterattack. He walked forward just like that, stopping several paces in front of the small catfish and asking with a smile, "Your nascent tier cultivation base is but an empty shell, with your true power only rivaling that of golden core tier cultivators. I seriously don't know who gave you the courage to openly display killing intent toward me. So be it if you displayed killing intent, but do you have the power to support and carry through your killing intent? Now look at me. I started to plot against you almost immediately after I arrived at Gorge Island, and I started to truly put a plan into action after my battle with Lu Laocheng when I realized that you were even more stubborn and unteachable than Gu Can. Since you entered the room, I've been speaking reason to you from the beginning to the end. After all, one has to speak reason no matter what. Is speaking reason useless? No, I think it's very useful. However, the method of speaking reason differs depending on whether the other party is a good person or a bad person. Many good people fail to understand this, and it's because of their lack of understanding that they suffer so many hardships and receive such unfair treatment from the world. Qian Ping'an extended a hand, but he didn't do so to grab the hilt of sword immortal. Instead, he placed his palm on the pommel and pushed the sword deeper, bit by bit, inch by inch. The sword blade continued to slide through Tan Shue's body. In fact, I wouldn't have been able to truly kill you even after ingesting that alchemical pill, Qian Ping'an revealed. However, the situation has changed now, and I should be powerful enough to genuinely kill you. If you don't believe me, then why don't you put up a struggle and try to break free? Don't the cultivators in Bamboo Scroll Lake like to gamble with their lives? Qian Ping'an waited for a moment, after which he smiled and remarked, "You're not very smart at all. However, your luck has been quite good. Do you know why I've never told you in Gukin the name of this sword? It's called Sword Immortal, as in terrestrial sword immortal. So I purposely refrained from revealing its name to you. Just think about it. What place produced the most sword immortals in ancient times in the eastern treasured Vile continent? It was the ancient Shu nation. But why did it produce so many sword immortals? Because there were many flood dragons roaming the nation, and they were the best whetstones for sword immortals wanting to sharpen their blades. In the end, Qian Ping'an said, so you've made the correct choice to not gamble with your life. Even if I didn't ingest that final alchemical pill, this sword would have still been itching to immediately shatter your heart after having a taste of your blood. I wouldn't have needed to expend any spiritual energy or mental energy to control it. In fact, I ingested that final alchemical pill for the sake of controlling this sword and holding it back from immediately killing you." Tan Shui felt ice cold, and there was a look of pity and pleading on its face. Qian Ping'an turned his head and pricked his ears, asking, "You also want to speak your reason?" However, he quickly straightened his body and placed his hand inside his opposite sleeves, saying with a smile, "But have you asked me whether or not I want to listen to your reasons?" There was harsh sword chi inside the room, and there was biting cold snow outside the room. It was as if the sword piercing through Tan Shue's heart and impaled in the door was linking the two worlds together. Tan Shui already knew that begging for its life would be futile, so both it and Qian Ping'an fell into a long period of silence. The young man standing in front of Tan Shui had started off with an entire lecture about principles and reasons, after which he had suddenly launched a swift and deadly attack. His words after he succeeded sounded like a review of his actions, something that made Tan Shue's hair stand on end. Almost all of the cultivators on Gorge Island felt like the bookkeeper living at the entrance of the island was a good-tempered and easygoing person. Tan Shui inhaled softly, yet this immediately caused it to feel searing pain rip through its chest. Not only was its physical body severely wounded, but there was surging chaos in the depths of its soul. All living beings feared death, and this was the most realistic feeling in the world. This was the so-called minor singularity that Qian Ping'an had alluded to. Tan Shui had understood him, yet it had pretended to be puzzled. When Tan Shui clearly felt its life force flowing away, and when it even started to detect its incredibly mystical great Tao crumbling away piece by piece, it was as if Tan Shui were the most miserly and wealthy person in the world looking on helplessly as their tails of gold fell to the ground one after another, yet they were unable to pick them up no matter what. It would then reach over with a single hand and twist off the young man's head, venting the wrathful fury in its mind. However, Tan Shui quickly ceased its struggle. One reason was the excruciating pain that would shoot through its body every time it moved, no matter how small its movements. More importantly, the young man who had victory firmly within his grasp, the bookkeeper who liked to slowly and steadily build a foundation and enact his plan, didn't show any signs of worry. There was an increasingly derisive smile on his face, and it didn't seem like he was facing a powerful enemy at all. Qian Ping'an's face was as pale as a sheet, and his cheeks were also slightly red in a sickly sense. Perhaps this was due to the 4 secret alchemical pills from the water palace that Qian Ping'an had ingested. And perhaps things were exacerbated by his manipulation of Sword Immortal, a pseudo-celestial tool. He was pushing himself too hard. Qian Pingin's voice was slow as he said, "Even though I haven't refined this sword and transformed it into my own, carrying it around for an extended period of time has allowed its sword chi to wash through my soul. Our minds are somewhat linked, and the sword is like a young child who can't yet speak." Qian Pingin pointed at the remaining half of the blade that hadn't penetrated through Tan Shue's body, continuing, "It's clearly telling me that you still harbored killing intent toward me when you were begging for your life just then. You wanted to unleash your full power and sacrifice yourself in order to kill me. What's this? You're feeling too embarrassed and ashamed after becoming such a pitiful victim of my plans, so you want to fight to your last breath and win back some face." Tan Shui could only respond with silence. The small catfish was filled with grief and pain. Perhaps it was truly wrong? But where and how is it wrong? As if seeing through Tan Shue's thoughts, Qian Pingin explained, "If you want to know where you were wrong, what if I said that as the descendant of a true dragon, you shouldn't have used your extremely powerful mind and willpower to continuously and subtly influence Gu Qian's mind? In reality, Lu Jimao can't be regarded as Gu Qian's master at all. Gu Qian's mother and you, a beast, are his true masters. This is because Gu can trust the two of you the most. On the other hand, he's always remained wary of Lu Jimao, although Lu Jimao has also influenced him quite significantly. For example, Gu Qian's understanding of Bamboo Scroll Lake and his understanding of how to interact with people in this toilet of a world are greatly influenced by what he secretly learned from Lu Jimao. It's just that this is nothing compared to what Gu can learn from you and his mother. You definitely won't admit your wrongdoings after hearing this from me. So let's just pretend that your mistake was being too stupid. You mistakenly thought that I was also a member of Bamboo Scroll Lake. So my relatively low cultivation base would allow you to achieve victory through brute strength. What are you trying to do?" Tan Shui asked. "I'm thinking about how you're going to die, and I'm contemplating how to make the most of your corpse after you're dead," Qian Pingin replied. "I no longer doubt the fact that I'll die, but don't forget that I'm ultimately a nascent tier cultivator. You'll also be killed," Tan Shui said. Qian Pingin's eyes were filled with disappointment as he looked at the small catfish. At this moment, Tan Shui finally attempted to consider problems from the stance and perspective of Qian Pingin. It was as if Tan Shui were finally viewing him as a worthy equal on the Go board. It was as if Tan Shui were finally putting some thought into his Go philosophy and Go strategies. "I'm sure that you have your ways to stay alive, so I hope you can reveal them to me and kill off my final glimmer of hope. Don't try to fool me and say that it's your two flying swords. I know they're not your trump card," Tan Shui said. On Osmanthus Island, an intercontinental ship from Old Dragon City, there was an elderly boatman who's extremely famous in the history books, Qian Pingin said slowly. He owned a dragon beating pole which had the characters, "Concentrate on the task at hand," engraved on it, and he used this pole as a means to safely sail his boat across the Flood Dragon Trench. I was able to witness it when I traveled on an intercontinental ship to Stalactite Mountain. Yet all of the cultivators on Osmanthus Island were unaware that the characters on the pole were actually a lock-slashing talisman described in an ancient text. This talisman is specifically used to suppress flood dragons, and it only becomes a complete talisman after 4 extra characters, Decree of the Rain Gods, are added in ancient seal script. Unfortunately for you, I also know this talisman and am able to draw the required characters. Moreover, the power of the talisman will be quite decent. The talisman wouldn't be able to kill you if it wasn't for Sword Immortal impaling you to the door, and it would perhaps even struggle to keep you contained. With your current state, however, the talisman is more than powerful enough to suppress you. After all, I spent a very long time late one night to complete a lock-slashing talisman that contained brimming spiritual energy in its talismanic core." Qian Pingin smiled and continued, "I asked you to sit beside the table just then, so are you now feeling regretful that you didn't listen to me just then? In reality, there's no need for you to feel so upset. Your thought process is far too simple after all, and I'm completely aware of what you're thinking. You're simply oblivious to this fact. You and Gu can left the Jewel Small World relatively early back then, so you didn't see how I killed Dawn Cloud Mountain's Kai Jinjian before I started to practice fist techniques. Nor did you see how I almost killed Old Dragon City's Fu Nanhua." Qian Pingin pointed at his brain and chuckled. "So even though you've assumed human form, you're a human in appearance only. Because you're lacking this. Tan Shue's back was seared by scorching heat as it leaned against the door, causing it to come to a sudden realization and screech. You drew that talisman on the door. Qian Pingyan raised a finger to his lips, gesturing for the small catfish to lower its voice. He then smiled and asked, Do you find this very strange? Why were you completely unable to detect the presence of such a powerful talisman? There was ice-cold despair in Tan Shue's heart. Qian Pingyan answered his own question, revealing, This is because the talisman was incomplete, still lacking some spiritual energy in its talismanic core. It's not that I can't draw a complete lock-slashing talisman right now, but I'll need to pay a relatively high price to draw such a high-grade talisman. Moreover, you're a nascent tier cultivator after all, meaning that you're extremely sensitive to the flow of spiritual energy in the world. If the talisman was complete, then you might have refused to enter the room after knocking on the door. Doesn't everyone like to refer to me as Mr. Bookkeeper? That being the case, I felt like I couldn't betray the love shown to me by everyone on Cyan Gorge Island. The blood from your heart completed the last critical component of the talisman. Qian Pingyan looked at the small catfish and asked, Do you think I named you Tan Shue for no reason? The situation right now is a case of charcoal and snow coexisting in the same cauldron. However, it's a shame that I'm not Gu Kan. I don't have a close relationship with you. As he spoke, Qian Pingyan retrieved 2 golden talismans from his minimization treasure, after which he continued, In fact, I did draw 2 complete talismans as well, so what are you going to do now? Are you still confident that you can kill me before you die? You said that the 2 flying swords aren't my trump card, but you were only half correct in your assessment. We've traveled together for a long time, and you can't begin to imagine how many powerful enemies and life and death struggles we've overcome together. 1st and 15th soared out from Qian Pingyan's sword-nurturing gourd, with each piercing through the talismanic core of a talisman and unleashing a brilliant burst of spiritual light. It was as if 2 warm and bright charcoal baskets had appeared in the room. 1 flying sword hovered in front of Tan Shue's glabella, pointing straight at the small catfish's acupoint in that location. The other flying sword hovered in front of the sea of qi located in Tan Shue's abdomen. Qian Pingyan smiled and said in reassurance, Don't worry, I wasn't targeting you when I drove the blade further in just then. I was simply greeting the guest outside the door. At the same time, I wanted you to understand the concept of making the most of everything, lest you mistakenly think that I'm bluffing again. Qian Pingyan took several steps forward, surprisingly ignoring the young woman impaled to the door as he lightly opened it and said with a faint smile, Sorry for making you wait, true lord. As it turned out, the river-severing true lord Lu Jimao had already been standing in the snow outside for a long time. Lu Jimao was a powerful nascent tier cultivator, so if he purposely concealed his aura, even someone as powerful as Tan Shue wouldn't be able to detect his presence. As such, Qian Pingyan shouldn't have been able to detect his presence either. Lu Jimao had extremely sharp senses, and he had already noticed the commotion from his residence, the Hengbo residence, when Qian Pingyan's pseudo-celestial tool left its scabbard. However, he had been hesitant and indecisive at the time, and he was unwilling to rashly visit Qian Pingyan's residence to investigate the situation. In the end, Lu Jimao was ultimately unable to sit still when the tip of sword immortal pierced through the door. He silently left the secret room in his residence and made his way to the entrance of Cyan Gorge Island. Lu Jimao had already been standing in the snow outside for 10 minutes. Qian Pingyan turned to his side and said, Please come in and take a seat, true lord. Lu Jimao sighed in his mind, yet there was a smile on his face as he strode inside and walked around the bluestone slab before taking a seat beside the study table. Qian Pingyan closed the door again, and even though his motion was gentle, the sword running through the pitiful Tan Shue's heart still made it feel ice-cold and agonizing pain. Meanwhile, the talisman drawn on the door made Tan Shue feel as if it were being cooked in a pot of boiling oil. Punished by both freezing cold and searing heat, Tan Shue was experiencing inhumane torture at this moment. Qian Pingyan and Lu Jimao sat opposite each other again. Lu Jimao once again retrieved his white bowl and placed it on the table, lightly pushing it forward and evidently asking for wine again. It's because a guest like Mr. Chun exists that a host like me also exists. This is a great blessing. Qian Pingyan waved a hand, summoning the sword-nurturing gourd into his palm and pouring a bowl of wine for Lu Jimao. He was far more generous this time around, and he filled the white bowl to the brim with Crocaw wine. However, he didn't push the bull back straight away, instead asking, "Have you thought things through? Or more accurately, have you reached an agreement with Island Master Tan Yuani?" Lu Jimao smiled and responded with a question of his own, asking, "Mr. Chan, are you telling me that you can't determine whether Tan Yuani reached an agreement or whether talks fell through when he went to Palace Willow Island?" Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, "I'm not an immortal who can read minds, so I naturally can't determine the outcome of his talks." Lu Jimao sighed with emotion and remarked, "If Mr. Chan visited Millet Grain Island and met a few times with Island Master Tan Yuani on the lakeside, then perhaps you could have pieced together the clues and come up with an answer. Mr. Chan is skilled at deduction, so it's only right that you're skilled at determining these matters as well." Chan Ping'an shook his head again, replying, "My deduction skills aren't impressive at all. You only find them impressive because you've never come across mighty figures with genuinely impressive divination and deduction skills. Perhaps I'm too blunt, so please don't take offense, true lord." Lu Jimao took a deep breath and replied, "Truth be told, even though Tan Yuani is an overseer from the Greatly Empire's Green Ripple Pavilion who looks after the central region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, he was still fairly unhappy after his secret meeting with Lu Laocheng on the island. Tan Yuani proposed 2 conditions at the time, one genuine and one false." Lu Jimao paused for a moment, and he couldn't help but sigh softly with emotion in his mind upon seeing Chan Ping'an sitting there and silently waiting for him to continue. In reality, Chan Ping'an could roughly guess the truth after hearing the words, one genuine and one false. Even so, he still chose to remain silent. He could afford to wait, and he was willing to take things slowly. Only experienced cultivators with Lu Jimao's cultivation base and a lofty enough disposition could understand the subtle and mystical nature of Chan Ping'an's mind. Of course, the Greatly Empire's Imperial Song clan will definitely need to share their profits with Lu Laocheng in the future. With this as the foundation, Lu Laocheng isn't allowed to target me or Cyan Gorge Island, neither openly nor in secret. However, Tan Yuani most likely made this small request in a very tactful manner when he was negotiating with Lu Laocheng. Lu Jimao sighed and continued, "Even after making such concessions, Lu Laocheng was still unwilling to agree to our proposals. In fact, he wasn't even willing to give my title, the so-called ruler of Bamboo Scroll Lake, to Cyan Gorge Island. He simply told Tan Yuani that Bamboo Scroll Lake wouldn't have a so-called ruler or whatnot in the future. After all, this was nothing more than a huge joke." Chan Ping'an frowned slightly upon hearing this. He was temporarily unable to figure out Lu Laocheng's reason for doing this. This was because he had no clue about the plans of the Jade Tablet sect's Sun Yuan, both regarding his choice of Bamboo Scroll Lake as the location of his lower sect as well as his alliance with Lu Laocheng. He was even more clueless about the fact that Zhang Shangzhen, his so-called old acquaintance who owned the Cloud Cave Blessed Land, was going to become the first sect leader of the lower sect. This was the lower sect of the Jade Tablet sect, so it definitely wouldn't complain about Bamboo Scroll Lake being too big. It would only complain about Bamboo Scroll Lake being too small. In fact, even the vassal states of the luminous Vermilion Empire that were located near Bamboo Scroll Lake, for example the Stonebrush Nation, might be annexed and transformed into the jurisdiction of the lower sect. How could a powerful force allow others to challenge their rule? Just who did Lu Jimao, a measly nascent tier cultivator, think he was? However, Lu Jimao was oblivious to these matters, as was Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuani. Whether purposely or otherwise, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan had concealed these matters from Tan Yuani for the sake of his grand scheme. He wanted to defeat Cui Dongshan and have his other self wholeheartedly accept his loss. That way, they could decide who was primary and who was secondary, and Cui Dongshan would willingly leave Mountain Cliff Academy and be at Cui Chan's disposal. Cui Dongshan would help Cui Chan and the Greatly Empire stabilize their rule over their vast territory in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. And as for whether it was the North or the South, Cui Chan had given Cui Dongshan a choice back then. He could either guard the territory to the north of Lakeview Academy, or he could fight to conquer more lands in the south. To someone like Cui Chan, no one and nothing in the world could be trusted. However, was it really the case that he couldn't even trust himself? If that were the case, then wouldn't he be questioning his own great Tao? That would be similar to how Chan Ping'an had rejected his identity as an immortal from the mountains in the depths of his heart, thereby causing his newly formed bridge of immortality to be so fragile that he couldn't even set foot on it. Even though Cui Chan had split into two and Cui Dongshan could only be regarded as half of him, it was ultimately the case that neither he nor Cui Chan were mediocre individuals who only knew how to play small tricks. Since they had decided to sit down and play a serious game of Go with each other, they would definitely accept the outcome regardless of whether they won or lost. In any case, they would merely be losing to the other half of themselves. Once Cui Dongshan left Mountain Cliff Academy and gave it his all to assist the Great Li Empire, it would be as if the Great Li Empire had suddenly gained a second embroidered tiger. Before Cui Chan left the tall building in Pond Water City, Cui Dongshan had half-joked that even he was afraid at the thought of two embroidered tigers working together. So how could the Great Li Empire possibly lose in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent? Chen Ping'an fell silent as he digested the news. It was half good and half bad. It was good in the sense that Lu Jimao's ability to negotiate with him had fallen to an all-time low. With Lu Laocheng, the ruler of Palace Willow Island, being so firm and stubborn, Lu Jimao's capital to use against Chen Ping'an would become weaker and weaker. This was true for Cyan Gorge Island's Spring Courtyard Mansion as well as the Vermilion Cord residence. However, it was bad in the sense that Chen Ping'an would need to make greater concessions to the Great Li Empire if he wanted to achieve his objectives. In fact, Chen Ping'an started to question whether Tan Yuanyi from Millet Grain Island was qualified enough to influence the critical strategies of the Great Li Empire. Was he qualified to represent the Great Li Empire and make deals with him in Bamboo Scroll Lake on behalf of the Imperial Song clan? If Tan Yuanyi wasn't influential enough, then Chen Ping'an would be wasting his time and effort if he continued to negotiate with him. Chen Ping'an was even more afraid of Tan Yuanyi being deployed to someplace else in the Great Li Empire due to his meritorious contributions. If another official from the Great Li Empire took over matters at Bamboo Scroll Lake, then Chen Ping'an's slightly positive relationship with Tan Yuanyi would only make matters more difficult. The worst-case scenario was Lu Laocheng interfering in Tan Yuanyi's matters and causing the situation in Bamboo Scroll Lake to change in unpredictable ways. One had to understand that the most meritorious party in the process of Bamboo Scroll Lake falling to the Great Li Empire wasn't Millet Grain Island or whatnot. Rather, it was the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire stationed on the border of the luminous Vermilion Empire. It was this army that had cut through enemy ranks with ease and decided the ownership of Bamboo Scroll Lake. Once the pillar clans in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire offered their conclusion on Tan Yuanyi's performance, designating it as unfavorable, Chen Ping'an would no longer need to travel to Millet Grain Island. After all, Tan Yuanyi would already be struggling to stay alive himself, and he might even need to grab onto Chen Ping'an and treat him as a life-saving hope. His grip would be tight, so tight that he wouldn't let go no matter what. Chen Ping'an would be his final ray of hope to turn things around. At that time, Tan Yuanyi, an Earth immortal who had decided the fate of Azure Mound Island and Heavenly Governess Island in a single night, would become even more terrifying and unscrupulous. Things were as simple as this. Chen Ping'an had impaled Tan Shui to the door tonight. However, Chen Ping'an might very well become the next Tan Shui. This was the true nature of the cultivation world, where one needed to take responsibility for their own life and death. Lu Jimao didn't interrupt the young bookkeeper's thinking, and he patiently waited for Chen Ping'an to say something. When Chen Ping'an finally spoke, the first thing he said was, "True Lord, can I please trouble you with inviting Tan Yuanyi to Cyan Gorge Island for a secret meeting with me? The sooner the better." Lu Jimao breathed a sigh of relief. However, what Chen Ping'an said next immediately caused Lu Jimao to feel anxious and extremely troubled. Both you and I are aware that Tan Yuanyi was unsuccessful in his talks at Palace Willow Island, and Lu Laocheng definitely wasn't asking for an exorbitant amount of benefits so that you people could haggle with him to lower the price. Right now, Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuanyi is like a mud pit that can leave others absolutely filthy if they become involved in the situation and aren't careful enough. So, I have two conditions. Firstly, you have to remove the secret restriction that you've placed on Gu Kan's mother. Don't ask me whether or not I'll suspect you of agreeing but not carrying out your promise. We both know each other's bottom lines, so there's no need to engage in such meaningless probing. You're even more aware of my attitude toward the Spring Courtyard Mansion at this moment. Secondly, you need to give up your control over the Vermilion Cord Residence's Hong Su, and hand her to me. Tan Yuanyi is unable to help us, so let me personally negotiate with Lu Laocheng. Chen Ping'an's voice became solemn as he added, "In any case, the second condition isn't really a condition, So think through this carefully, Lu Jimao. Staying alive is the biggest source of hope and possibility. This isn't just a rule of Bamboo Scroll Lake, but it's also a fundamental rule for all vagrant cultivators and itinerant cultivators in the world. I accept your proposal, Lu Jimao replied without hesitation. Chen Ping'an appeared slightly surprised. Lu Jimao spread open one of his hands. Chen Ping'an smiled faintly and pushed the brimming white bowl of wine back to Lu Jimao. Lu Jimao grabbed the bowl and took a swig of wine before saying, Mr. Chen is my only like-minded acquaintance in Bamboo Scroll Lake, so I naturally have to show some sincerity as well. Lu Jimao turned around to glance at the small catfish, and when he turned back, he pointed at his brain and remarked, I do have this important part. Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, a like-minded acquaintance of True Lord? Are you trying to insult me? Lu Jimao wasn't angered at all, and he laughed heartily as he said, see? And you're still trying to deny that you're a like-minded acquaintance. Tan Shui was seemingly on the verge of death, yet it still turned its head slightly to look at the two men who were enjoying a hearty conversation with each other. The small catfish listened to their discussions that could very likely determine the fate of Bamboo Scroll Lake. Tan Shui slightly understood the hidden meaning of Chen Ping'an's words. Tan Shui also made insinuations when it spoke, and doing so was something that it understood well. For example, Chen Ping'an had seen through Tan Shui's words when it said that it was still yet to gain sentience in the Jewel Small World. By implication, the small catfish had only just started to gain sentience and remember things after it arrived at Bamboo Scroll Lake, and it had only started to truly become sentient and able after arriving at the Spring Courtyard Mansion. In other words, all of the crimes and wrongdoings had little to do with it, with the main culprits instead being Gu Kan and his mother. However, this was nothing compared to the hidden meaning in Chen Ping'an's words. Lu Jimao was the ruler of Cyan Gorge Island, yet after walking in and sitting down, he needed to seek Chen Ping'an's approval before he could even drink a bowl of wine. Not only that, but he appeared quite happy after finally receiving his white bowl back and taking a swig of wine. Lu Jimao was an experienced nascent tier cultivator that even Tan Shui felt very apprehensive of, yet he had actually used the term like-minded acquaintance to describe Chen Ping'an, someone who was yet to turn 20. Only at this moment did Tan Shui concede that it was indeed not smart enough compared to Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an pointed at Tan Shui and said to Lu Jimao, the imperial preceptor of the Great Li Empire will like the corpse of this nascent tier flood dragon. This is a bargaining chip that I've only just obtained. If I successfully strike a deal with the imperial preceptor, then I can guarantee that you won't die. If all else fails, you can at least obtain a peace and safety tablet from the Great Li Empire and flee from Bamboo Scroll Lake. In the future, you'll at least have some hope of becoming a guest elder of the Great Li Empire. So, even if the talks between Millet Grain Island and Lu Laocheng break down, I can still help you avoid falling victim to that most undesirable possibility. Lu Jimao smiled with squinted eyes and asked, is Mr. Chen truly willing to sacrifice this beast? Chen Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and took a swig of wine, following which he pointed at Tan Shui and replied, I've already given it multiple chances, and it wouldn't have fallen into such a wretched state if it managed to grab just one of those chances. Who can it blame? Me for not being as lenient as a bodhisattva? Taking 10,000 steps back, it's not like I'm a benevolent bodhisattva anyway. Lu Jimao nodded lightly, expressing strong agreement with Chen Ping'an's words. If the young man in front of him didn't possess such strength and intelligence, then he wouldn't have come to visit, nor would he have shamelessly asked for a bowl of wine. Why hadn't Lu Jimao immediately agreed to Chen Ping'an's proposal during his first visit? One reason was because he still held on to a sliver of hope, hoping that Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuani could reach a deal with Lu Laocheng. If that were the case, then Lu Jimao wouldn't need to continue his interactions with Chen Ping'an. The two of them could simply mind their own business and refrain from interfering with each other. Another reason was the fact that Chen Ping'an could understand many things, but was he truly able to act on his understanding? The subtle restrictions on Hong Su, Gu Kan's mother in the Spring Courtyard Mansion, and other similar methods didn't make Lu Jimao feel genuinely at ease. Why did scholars claim that all trades and occupations were inferior to studying? Yet, they turned around and slapped themselves in the face, also remarking that scholars were the most useless people in the world. This was because understanding a matter was one thing, but how to act on this understanding was another thing altogether. With this in mind, Chen Ping'an's method of dealing with the beast that had wild ambitions but a fragile life was an intangible threshold. If Chen Ping'an could overcome this threshold and perform resolutely and impressively, then only then would Lu Jimao be truly willing to interact with him and deal with him. Conflict and death were inevitable. However, knowledge and nuance were required regarding how to engage in these conflicts and deaths. In Lu Jimao's eyes, the actions of Gu Kan and the small catfish were nothing more than little children playing house. In fact, the same could be said for Lu Kaisang, Yuan, and the other so-called prodigies. They merely shouted louder and shattered more porcelain wares on the floor. Yet they truly thought that they were unparalleled in the world? However, Lu Jimao didn't view this as bad, and he instead viewed it as extremely ideal. The more of these little idiots there were, the better. These people acted on a whim, wantonly killing people with their amateur fists whenever they felt like it. However, they had no clue how much of their power and influence was granted by the might of their islands or ancestors. That being the case, did Lu Jimao need to worry about them? The more of these idiots there were, the firmer Lu Jimao's grip on his power. Yet, it was a shame that the more experienced Lu Laoqing had now returned. Since there was already Lu Jimao, why did there still need to be Lu Laoqing? Lu Jimao could only sigh and lament that fate wasn't on his side. He was acting so politely and submissively in front of his young junior. And was this not because of the forces of the unstoppable trend? Was this not because of that jade tablet, the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire, and the changes sweeping through the central region of the eastern treasured vile continent? However, the biggest difference between Chen Ping'an and other people was his ability to clearly understand these matters. At the same time, his speech and manners were seemingly all adhering to some sort of rules that even Lu Jimao found extremely strange. And when these sentences and small matters continually gathered together to form and reveal the rules, Lu Jimao was somehow willing to put his trust in them. Lu Jimao suddenly chuckled in anger and said, "It was Lu Laoqing before and it's Mr. Chan now, so by the looks of it, it's truly unsuitable for me to stay at Bamboo Scroll Lake. It's time for me to move out, what with people thriving on change and all that. If Mr. Chun can truly obtain a peace and safety tablet for me, then I'll definitely repay the favor handsomely." Chen Ping'an paid no heed to this promise. Perhaps Lu Jimao was sincere in his offer, but the intentions of the speaker were of little importance. Most importantly, the listener couldn't take these offers too seriously. Worldly matters were unpredictable, and the sincere offers of today might crumble due to the events of tomorrow. Even an innately good person like Zheng Yi could go astray and mistakenly think that Chen Ping'an could be fully relied on simply because he was a good person. Afterward, he had started to daydream about the bright and beautiful future, gaining a Tao Guardian, becoming master and disciple, advancing to the middle 5 tiers, attaining the Great Tao, and most certainly visiting Thatch Moon Island again to visit his master as well as that evil-hearted ancestor. Perhaps Zheng Yi would never find out that this subtle change in his mindset had surprisingly astounded Chen Ping'an, the bookkeeper next door and the powerful cultivator, who was able to remain unfazed even in front of Lu Laoqing. Chen Ping'an had suddenly felt a pang of terror. Because of this, Zhang Ye's life, which could have indeed gone on an upward trend, had almost started to tumble onto a downward slope again. Chen Ping'an was even able to predict that if things truly played out like that, then Zheng Yi would be extremely justified when he blamed the heavens and other people on the day that Chen Ping'an finally came to a realization. There was only one thing that he didn't know. Zheng Yi was already backed into a corner where he no longer had any choices. Yet he couldn't even pass the test pertaining to Chen Ping'an that he had to face. Since this was the case, could he truly pass other challenges even if he were given alternative opportunities? Would he rely on luck? Or would he rely on fate? Or perhaps he would rely on the unexplainable favor of some mighty figure. Chen Ping'an had never thought that his manner of interacting with the world and its people was definitely the most suitable for Zheng Yi. Chen Ping'an was no exception. In his hometown, the medicinal herbs in the Yang family's medicine shop had been his only choice. Even so, his mother had still passed away in the end. In Clay Vase Alley, where curling smoke rose from the houses, only a single woman had been willing to open her door and invite him inside. During that time of extreme hardship for Chen Ping'an, entering her house had been his best choice. Now, however, it had become his worst choice. The mountain shaking guide had also been the sole choice for the young boy in straw sandals all those years ago. Fortunately, even until today, Chen Ping'an still viewed this as one of his best choices. Life was off then. There were many times where there were no options to choose from. There was no fork road that offered a choice between correct and incorrect, good and bad. The heavens would simply place its hand on one's head and force one to walk forward. During these times, people could only do one thing. Consider how they would walk down this solitary path. Only after walking down this solitary path would one have the opportunity to arrive in front of a fork road. Only then would the small paths and single log bridges potentially transform into wide roads. When observing the path of Zhang Yi and seeing the fluctuations in his mind, Qian Ping'an had once again felt a sense of helplessness and even exhaustion. The ability to identify mistakes and make positive changes was a great virtue. As it turned out, the most difficult part wasn't making positive changes, but identifying the mistakes in the first place. This applied to Gu Kan, and it also applied to Zhang Yi, whose personality was on the opposite extreme to Gu Kan. Zhang Yi would also make mistakes. The only difference was that Zhang Yi was still very weak and immature right now, both in terms of his cultivation and his character. As such, there was still an opportunity for him to gradually refine and perfect himself. Qian Ping'an wouldn't expound his own principles and reasons to Zhang Yi, and he instead chose to teach him the fundamental manner to view the world. As long as Zhang Yi continued to learn, then it would be as if he were holding an umbrella in his hand, one that could protect him from the wind and rain. If, on the other hand, Qian Ping'an only expounded his principles and reasons to Zhang Yi, leaving him completely clueless about the complex nature of the world, then he would merely be weaving a basket and telling Zhang Yi to carry it. Afterward, Qian Ping'an's teachings would be forcefully stuffed into the basket, not only failing to make the path forward smoother for Zhang Yi, but even inhibiting him and making it increasingly difficult to advance. A price had to be paid regardless of whether Qian Ping'an expounded his principles or not. Filling a basket with knowledge wasn't necessarily a good thing. The characters in the world contained power, while knowledge formed from the combination of characters possessed weight. This was similar to the true Qi eight-tailed talisman that old man Yang had drawn on Qian Ping'an's legs back then. While the talismans made it more difficult for Qian Ping'an to walk, they also allowed him to temper his martial arts cultivation. Qian Ping'an had only mulled over things and obtained this knowledge after the fifth path pertaining to Zhang Yi had appeared. This wasn't to say that Qian Ping'an had no understanding of these matters before, but rather that he hadn't understood these matters thoroughly. If he walked too fast, then the young boy wouldn't have enough time to follow. As it turned out, it was most terrifying to have a bucket half full of knowledge. The bucket would sway back and forth as one walked, naturally making things extremely difficult for the person carrying the bucket. Lu Jimao suddenly smiled and uttered an earth-shattering question, asking, "Mr. Qian, could it be that you're observing Tao and integrating with Tao?" Qian Ping'an sipped some wine and jokingly replied, "So True Lord truly is a like-minded person." Lu Jimao solemnly set down his bowl of wine, cupping his fists and replying, "The great Tao of you and I are different, and we were even mortal enemies in the past. However, Mr. Chen's ability to achieve the feat of Earth Immortals as a lower 5-tier cultivator is well deserving of my respect. I'll also be extremely grateful if True Lord can tell me about his life journey and help me observe more Tao," Qian Ping'an said in an amused voice. Lu Jimao hurriedly waved his hand and replied, "Like-minded people can be either friends or enemies. There's no distinction between them. Right now, we're at most not enemies with each other. At least not for the near future. If we come into conflict with each other again in the future, then we'll each rely on our own abilities at that time. Since we're not friends, why should I help Mr. Qian? If I remember correctly, Mr. Qian owes the secret storage chamber of Cyan Gorge Island many immortal coins. If Mr. Qian is willing to give the jade tablet to me, or even just lend it to me for 100 years, I can indeed tell my story openly and truthfully. I'll answer all of Mr. Qian's questions, and I'll reveal everything even if Mr. Qian doesn't have any questions. I'll recount everything regardless of whether I should reveal them or not." The original owner of the Jade Tablet was one of the 72 saints of the Middle-earth Divine Continent's scholarly temple. They belonged to the Second Sage's scholarly lineage, and they were also the great sage stationed above the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent and overseeing the situation there. Lu Jimao naturally understood what was important and what wasn't. He felt both apprehensive and tempted. As for whether Lu Jimao could obtain what he wanted, this was simply dependent on whether Qian Ping'an dared to give the item away. Indeed, Lu Jimao didn't fully understand the true rules and regulations of the Confucian sect, Whereas Qian Pingyan understood far more than him, Qian Pingyan smiled and said, "Don't even think about it." Lu Zhimao hadn't been hopeful to begin with, so he naturally wasn't disappointed with this response. Qian Pingyan suddenly asked, "If I hold the jade tablet and absorb spiritual energy and water fortune from Bamboo Scroll Lake without restraint, snatching it all for myself until the lake dries up, will you, Lu Laoqing, or the Great Li Empire stop me? Will any of you dare to stop me?" Lu Zhimao's expression immediately froze. Qian Pingyan smiled faintly and added, "Rest assured, this is reasonable, but it's of course not according to etiquette. So even if none of you dare to stop me, I still won't dare to do something. Of course, if I'm forced into a corner with no other choice, then I'll give it a shot and see whether I can advance to become an Earth Immortal in a single step." Lu Zhimao cupped his fists again, saying, "Mr. Qian, I beseech you not to engage in actions that will severely harm both sides. Such action will completely drain Bamboo Scroll Lake, and it will also cause you to lose your life-saving treasure once and for all." Qian Pingyan shook his head and replied, "My actions will only follow the actions of Bamboo Scroll Lake. This notion of order can't be ignored." After saying this, Qian Pingyan stood up and continued, "Let's go. I'll invite True Lord to the Spring Courtyard Mansion with me. Let's enjoy some winter solstice dumplings from my hometown together." Lu Zhimao also stood up, stealing a glance at the extremely pitiful small catfish as he did so. A pseudo-celestial tool, 2 bonded flying swords, and 3 lock-slashing talismans. These were all extremely effective reasons in Bamboo Scroll Lake. They were as effective as could be. Qian Pingyan didn't so much as glance at Tan Shui as he requested, "While we're heading over, I'll have to trouble True Lord with teaching me how to remove the skin of flood dragons. I'll listen to its final words when I return. After all, what if its reasons manage to win me over?" Lu Zhimao laughed heartily in response. The two of them left the room together. After arriving at the Spring Courtyard Mansion, they were greeted by Gu Qin, who was as pale as a sheet, as well as his mother, who couldn't conceal her panic. Qian Pingyan simply said, "Tan Shui is over at my place. I wanted to speak some reason with it, so it won't be coming over to eat dumplings tonight." After finishing the dumplings, Qian Pingyan put down his chopsticks and said that he was full, thanking Gu Qian's mother for the meal. Lu Zhimao also put down his chopsticks before taking his leave together with Qian Pingyan. The two of them parted ways after they left. Lu Zhimao returned to his Hengbo residence first, after which he secretly made his way back to the Spring Courtyard Mansion. Meanwhile, Qian Pingyan returned to his residence alone. Night had settled in, and he walked back through the wind and snow. The tip of Sword Immortal was still poking through the door. Qian Pingyan opened the door and walked inside, and Tan Shui's first comment to him was, "I don't want to die." Qian Pingyan closed the door and asked, "Is this the entirety of your reason?" He didn't pay any more heed to Tan Shui as he lit 2 lamps, one on his study desk and one on the table. He then retrieved the Hall of the Underworld from his bamboo case and placed it on the table. Afterward, he continued to busy himself with the task that he had been completing for the past few weeks. Tan Shui was still impaled to the door just like that. It was already past midnight. The exhausted Qian Pingyan drank some wine to refresh himself, after which he put the wooden Hall of the Underworld back into his bamboo case. He grabbed the charcoal basket and walked over to the window, gazing at Bamboo Scroll Lake that lay outside. The heavy snow had finally stopped. Qian Pingyan looked at the cold and desolate scenes of a snow-capped island, saying softly, "Of the 32 individuals recorded on the 4 pages, there was surprisingly not a single ghost or an entity who dared to ask me to exact revenge and kill you. So I feel like you deserve to die. I'm planning to change my mind, and I'm no longer prepared to make a deal with the Imperial Preceptor of the Great Li Empire." I ate a large bowl of dumplings at the Spring Courtyard Mansion, yet not a single person came to plead for you during that time. Just like you said, my golden scholarly core shattered by itself not long ago. Gu Qin didn't dare to ask about it, and tonight was no different. He still didn't dare to ask about it. Lu Zhimao is probably at the Spring Courtyard Mansion right now, helping to remove the restrictions that were placed on Gu Qian's mother. She'll most likely view him as an incredibly kind-hearted benefactor. As for me, I'll probably become the most ungrateful wretch in the eyes of the Spring Courtyard Mansion starting from tonight. Qian Pingyan held the charcoal basket in one hand as he walked to Tan Shui's side. using his other hand to grab the hilt of sword immortal. Tears streamed down Tan Shue's face, and the small catfish's Dao heart was on the verge of collapse as it murmured again and again, Chan Ping'an, I was wrong. I've genuinely seen the errors in my way. Chan Ping'an shook his head and said, no, you simply know that you're about to die. On this windy and snowy night, another visitor arrived outside Chan Ping'an's door. A young boy in dark green official garb sprinted over and kneeled down on the snowy ground outside the door. Chan Ping'an swept his sword sideways, cutting Tan Shui into two. The golden tip of sword immortal moved horizontally across the outside of the door, yet the wielder of the sword didn't immediately withdraw the blade. Chan Ping'an stood in the doorway and said, Gu Kan, I thought you would say that you would also commit suicide in front of me if I killed Tan Shui. Before I opened the door, I was still thinking whether this would be your own thought, or something that your mother taught you to say. Gu Kan looked up, sobbing silently as he did so. After leaving his hometown and living in Bamboo Scroll Lake for several years, this was the first time that Gu Kan was once again crying like the snotty little kid from Clay Vase Alley. Chan Ping'an looked up at the night sky, not retracting his gaze for a long time. He was standing under the eaves and holding a charcoal basket in his hand. Gu Kan was crying hysterically, much like a wounded child. Chan Ping'an had already turned his gaze back to Gu Kan, yet he still didn't open his mouth to say anything. Rather, he let Gu Kan kneel there and bawl, with tears and snot covering the young boy's face. Gu Kan continued to cry uncontrollably, all the way until his body started to convulse. When he ran out of energy, he started to sob quietly. After recovering some energy, he started to wail hysterically again, seemingly wanting to cry his heart out. Why didn't you plead with me? Chan Ping'an asked slowly. Is it because you knew it would be futile? Were you unwilling to lose your final chance just like that? After all, pleading for Tan Shui would have meant severing the final strand of relationship with me. My relationship with your spring courtyard mansion, your mother, and you, Gu Kan, would have finished once and for all. Is this the reason why you didn't plead with me? Did you finally come to the realization that you might not be able to stay alive in Bamboo Scroll Lake, even if Tan Shui were here to protect you? That being the case, perhaps it would be better to trade Tan Shui for me, Chan Ping'an, and have me become the door god of the Spring Courtyard Mansion. In this way, you and your mother might still be able to continue living like the past. Of course, things will be slightly less satisfying than before, and you'll no longer be able to confidently announce to me that you like to kill people. However, this is still better than being mysteriously slapped to death by a cultivator that you've never met before someday in the future, and being made to reunite with your family in the afterlife. Compared to this outcome, you've still come out on top. No. Gu Kan refused to speak, and he didn't wipe the tears and snot from his face either. He simply stared at Chan Ping'an with a blank expression. Each step through the thick snow caused a loud crunching sound to reverberate through the surroundings. Gu Kan didn't accept the charcoal basket. Chan Ping'an squatted down, coming face to face with Gu Kan and looking him in the eyes as he said, It's okay, Gu Kan. Tell me what you're really thinking. I'll listen to whatever you have to say. Gu Kan grabbed a large handful of snow before turning around and smearing it across his face. After doing this, he turned back around and sobbed. You're the worst, Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle in speechlessness. After hesitating for a moment, he replied, I can indeed be viewed as a good person in your Bamboo Scroll Lake. However, a good person becoming smart doesn't make them a bad person. Gu Kan immediately burst into tears again, exclaiming, Your Bamboo Scroll Lake, your Spring Courtyard Mansion, your mother and you. Chan Ping'an, you always like to speak. Let's not be, okay? Gu Kan covered his face with the back of his hands and started to sob. You can go home now, Chan Ping'an said. Gu Kan punched Chan Ping'an in the chest, causing him to fall backward into the snow. Gu Kan then stood up and quickly stumbled away. After running forward a dozen or so steps, Gu Kan stopped but didn't turn around, sobbing, Chan Ping'an, you were more important to me than the small catfish, and this was always the case before. However, it isn't like that anymore. Even if the small catfish is dead, it's still better than you. Chan Ping'an sat in the snow and gazed at Bamboo Scroll Lake. His mind was as calm as a tranquil pond. Chan Ping'an stood up, shaking off the snowflakes on his cotton robe before walking over to the dock and waiting for Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuani to arrive. With Lu Jimao's swift manner of dealing with things, He would have definitely used a flying sword to deliver a message to Millet Grain Island after returning to his Hengbo residence. However, Qian Ping'an suddenly thought of Tan Yuanyi's position as a spy deployed in the central region of the eastern treasured Vile continent by the Great Li Empire's Green Ripple Pavilion, meaning that he most likely wouldn't travel here on a boat. Instead, he would first notify Lu Jimao before secretly making his way to Cyan Gorge Island. With this in mind, Qian Ping'an turned around and directly headed to the Hengbo residence. At the Spring Courtyard mansion, Gu Qian's mother stood there with a fox fur coat, anxiously waiting for her son. When she saw Gu Qian return, she hurriedly walked over and asked, "How is the situation? Where's Tan Shui? She didn't come back with you." When Gu Qian and his mother had been making dumplings in the kitchen before, Gu Qian's expression had suddenly changed drastically, following which he had collapsed to the floor and clutched at his heart. It was as if he had been struck by a severe illness. Gu Qian's mother immediately knew that something had gone wrong, most likely Tan Shui suffering an accident outside the Spring Courtyard mansion. Gu Qian dazedly looked up and replied, "Tan Shui is dead." His mother was stunned, and she couldn't help but wonder if she had misheard. "Can, what did you just say?" "Tan Shui is dead," Gu Qian repeated. There was a furious expression on his mother's face as she exclaimed, "Dead? She died just like that? Tan Shui is a nascent tier flood dragon. How can she possibly die? Apart from that old bastard with the surname Lu at Palace Willow Island, who else in Bamboo Scroll Lake can kill Tan Shui?" Gu Qian looked at his mother and replied, "There's also Qian Ping'an." His mother was enraged and she yelled, "What nonsense are you spewing? Why would Qian Ping'an kill Tan Shui for no reason? And what right does he have to kill the small catfish that no longer belongs to him? Has he gone mad? That ungrateful little wretch. I should have let him starve to death in Clay Vase Alley back then. I knew he came to Cyan Gorge Island with ill intentions. That cursed little bastard." "Qian Ping'an might be able to hear you," Gu Qian suddenly said. His mother immediately shut her mouth and looked around with a panicked expression. Her face was deathly pale, much like the thick snow on the ground and the fox fur coat on her shoulders. His mother stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace, sobbing, "Oh, my pitiful son." Gu Qian remained expressionless. His physique and soul were extremely weak right now, and his hands and feet had already become ice-cold following his trek from the island entrance back to the Spring Courtyard mansion. After returning to the Hengbo residence again, Lu Jimao hesitated for a moment before asking his trusted butler to invite Zhang Yi over. He then went to the secret small sword resting ground that was similar to a sword chamber, inside of which there were precious high-grade messenger flying swords. Lu Jimao carefully contemplated his words before sending a letter to Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuanyi. In the end, Lu Jimao arrived inside a large hall that was decorated with a specialty rug from the colorful garment nation. He grabbed a ball of mist with a sweep of his hand, after which he scattered the mist across the floor and summoned an image showing the island entrance of Cyan Gorge Island. The heavy snow had already stopped, causing the scenery to appear slightly desolate. Lu Jimao gazed down at the images playing on the sheet of mist. During this time, he raised his head and looked outside the hall on several occasions. There was a helpless smile on Lu Jimao's face. There were close to 1,000 cultivators on Cyan Gorge Island right now, yet only Zhang Yi dared to take his sweet time after being summoned by the Hengbo residents. He definitely wouldn't rush over on the wind. As for whether Island Master Lu Jimao would feel displeased and take this to heart, the elderly Zhang Yi couldn't care less. Lu Jimao heaved a soft sigh. Almost all of his good friends whom he had fought alongside were already dead, either dying in their wars of conquest or dying at the hands of the myriad of assassins and surprise attacks. There were also some who were unruly and had become rebellious, and these people were personally disposed of by Lu Jimao. Of course, many more of them had died of old age, and in the end, only Zhang Yi remained by his side. He was Lu Jimao's last remaining friend from the past in Cyan Gorge Island. Lu Jimao directly walked through the screen composed of water fortune, arriving at the entrance where he hesitated briefly. In the end, he decided to step outside to wait for Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi was a Dragon Gate tier cultivator, one cultivation tier away from reaching the status of Earth Immortal, and he was more than powerful enough to conquer one of the 1,000 or so islands in Bamboo Scroll Lake and become an island master, even disregarding his relationship with Lu Jimao. During the past 2 years, Lu Zhimao had utilized the strategy of attacking nearby islands and allying with faraway islands, allowing him to conquer Whitefish Island as well as another dozen or so large islands. Afterward, he had wanted to give an island to Zhang Yi for him to establish his own estate, yet Zhang Yi, a meritorious official who had aided him for many years, had politely declined his offer on both occasions. Seeing this, Lu Zhimao hadn't insisted any further. When Lu Zhimao and Zhang Yi had first met, both of them had been at the sea observation tier. Zhang Yi was an official immortal at the time, and not only had he been Lu Zhimao's friend, but he had also been a military strategist offering his advice to Lu Zhimao in the background. It could be said that Zhang Yi had played a huge role in Cyan Gorge Island's ability to overcome challenge after challenge in its earlier days. Apart from Lu Zhimao gathering a group of powerful supporters and being ruthless toward his enemies, building his indomitable might, Zhang Yi's strategies had also proved to be critical. There were several reasons why Lu Zhimao still treated Zhang Yi with courtesy and respect. Apart from the valuable friendship that they had built up during the early days of hardship, Zhang Yi never hesitated to speak his mind even after he established himself on Cyan Gorge Island. This didn't change even after Lu Zhimao soared far above him on the path of cultivation. Because of this, Zhang Yi forcefully transformed himself from a meritorious official, who should have enjoyed many extravagant benefits, into an annoying official, who always criticized his leader without fear of death. Indeed, there were several occasions when Lu Zhimao had become furious at Zhang Yi's lack of sensitivity and tact. After all, would the rules be the same for a force that was fighting for territory versus a force that was guarding their territory? However, Zhang Yi continued to do things his own way, causing Lu Zhimao to grow more and more distant from him after the former advanced to the nascent tier. Lu Zhimao tasked him with looking after the fishing room and the storage chamber, meaning that Zhang Yi was performing the duties of local officials even though he was an official from the capital. It was very clear that Zhang Yi wasn't a favored official, resulting in his situation being relatively unfavorable in the past few years. He wasn't necessarily in a difficult situation, but compared to guest elder Yu Gui and the others who had come later but were enjoying all the limelight, Zhang Yi was indeed given fewer and fewer opportunities to do anything significant in Cyan Gorge Island. He still attended many banquets that were hosted on the island, yet he never opened his mouth to say anything, neither flattering the river-severing true lord in an obsequious manner nor pouring any cold water on his achievements. As if he were riding a galloping horse and looking at lights, many past events flashed through Lu Zhimao's mind. He surprisingly sighed with emotion as he thought about these ancient matters. His guest finally arrived. Zhang Yi continued to walk unhurriedly even after he saw Lu Zhimao. Not only that, but he was surprisingly holding a firm snowball in his hand as well. From this, it could be seen just how relaxed and leisurely Zhang Yi had been when making his way over. At the same time, one could imagine how anxious the messenger was feeling. The butler of the Hengbo residence was also a Dragon Gate tier cultivator, and his trip to look for Zhang Yi and invite him over had truly been a frustrating one. When he saw True Lord Lu Zhimao standing outside the door and waiting for Zhang Yi, however, his heart immediately jolted. He immediately started to feel a slight sense of regret for telling Zhang Yi to hurry up so many times during their trip. Fortunately, he hadn't grumbled or scolded Zhang Yi in any other way. Otherwise, he would have most likely suffered severe reprimands. Lu Zhimao waved his hand at the butler, gesturing for him to keep his distance from the hall. The butler immediately bowed and left upon seeing this. Zhang Yi cupped his fists and bowed in respect, saying, "Greetings, Island Master." Lu Zhimao smiled and gestured for Zhang Yi to stop, signaling that there was no need for Zhang Yi to treat him as an outsider and act so respectfully. The two of them entered the hall one after another, with Zhang Yi remaining silent as he looked at the image hovering above the splendid rug. Lu Zhimao didn't beat around the bush, saying straight away, "Back then, you in the fishing room faced many hardships and spent 8 entire years to find the reincarnation of that female golden core tier cultivator. You encouraged me to detain her at Cyan Gorge Island at the time, but I definitely shouldn't tamper with her in any other way. Moreover, I should only reveal this matter when Lu Laocheng returned to Palace Willow Island and eventually turned against me. When that time came, I could perhaps save my own life. I didn't believe you before, and we even got into an argument with each other. I called you foolishly benevolent and accused you of having a laughable understanding of Lu Laocheng. Looking at the current situation, you weren't necessarily correct, But I was most definitely wrong. Zhang Yi remained expressionless as he replied. It's a rare sight for Island Master to admit his mistakes. I do wonder, will the sun rise from the west tomorrow? Lu Jimao pointed at the stubborn old man, chuckling in mock anger and saying, If I were someone else, I would have already killed you 10 times over after seeing your filthy temper and listening to your grating words. Oh, then I must thank Island Master for kindly sparing my life, Zhang Yi said. Lu Jimao was just about to reply, yet he suddenly pointed at the image above the rug and said, Watch carefully. In the image, Gu Qian was kneeling in the snow outside Chen Ping'an's door. The young bookkeeper opened the door and spoke a few words, after which he held the charcoal basket in his hand and looked up. He looked up at them just like that. There was a gloomy expression on Lu Jimao's face. I suggest that Island Master put away this image. However, I surmise that it will be useless no matter what, Zhang Yi said. Lu Jimao extended a finger and lightly tapped on the image. He then flicked his sleeve and genuinely retracted the image. What do you think about Chen Ping'an? Lu Jimao asked. Zhang Yi thought for a moment and replied. He's quite terrifying. If he were a vagrant cultivator belonging to Bamboo Scroll Lake, then you could probably forget about your current position. Lu Jimao nodded and said, There are some secret matters between us that I won't reveal to you. It's not that I don't trust you, but it's perhaps better for you to not know about these matters. In any case, there are some small and harmless matters that I can reveal to you as entertainment. Zhang Yi didn't throw any more verbal jabs at Lu Jimao. Lu Jimao was referring to them as small matters, but they most definitely wouldn't be small matters in the grand scheme of things. Lu Jimao gave a detailed recount of his conversation with Chen Ping'an, as well as how they had enjoyed a meal of winter solstice dumplings at the spring courtyard mansion, and then each went their own way and did their own thing afterward. Say, why did Chen Ping and purposely bring me along to frighten that woman? And why did he gift me an opportunity to provide such a massive favor? Why did I need to keep the truth from her and act as a good person? Lu Jimao asked. Zhang Yi pondered for a moment before answering. The reason is simple. Chen Ping'an drew a clear line between himself and Gu Qian's mother when he moved out from the spring courtyard mansion, but he did so in a relatively gentle manner that allowed both sides to retreat with dignity. The situation wouldn't become too tense or sour. However, Gu Qian's mother most likely only felt a sense of relief at the time, not understanding Chen Ping'an's true intentions. Afterward, Chen Ping'an was merely reassuring them when he occasionally visited the spring courtyard mansion to have meals with them. Gu Qian's mother gradually felt at ease, reaching a mental state where she felt most comfortable, at least in her own mind. Chen Ping'an would no longer have a detrimental influence on Gu Qian and lead him astray, causing him to become a death-seeking good person. Only tonight, when Chen Ping'an invited Island Master along to the spring courtyard mansion to eat dumplings with them, did Gu Qian's mother finally come to the realization that they were already strangers. After explaining these matters that were extremely close to the truth, Zhang Yi asked, An outsider like me merely paid some extra attention to Chen Ping'an, yet I was already able to see through all this. That being the case, why did Island Master ask for my opinion? What, perhaps you're afraid that I've been cast aside and haven't needed to use my brain for too long. So I've become as rusty as that woman in the spring courtyard mansion who likes to view herself as a noble lady? Even if my brain has gone rusty, it should still be enough for me to help Island Master look after the secret chamber and the fishing room, right? Perhaps you're worried about my control over the secret chamber, and you're afraid that I'll grab everything and run upon seeing the dire situation of Cyan Gorge Island? You're afraid that I'll flee with all of the treasures? Go on, tell me which trusted subordinate you want to hand the secret chamber to. Rest assured, Island Master, I won't insist on staying in my position. However, I'll criticize Island Master one last time if I think the candidate is unsuitable. Stop spewing nonsense. Lu Jimao scolded with a smile. Then what are you trying to achieve? Zhang Yi asked slowly. It's not that I'm belittling myself, but I genuinely can't provide much help with the current state of things. I won't agree if you ask me to become a sacrificial pawn, and this won't change even though I'm aware that I don't have many years left to live. I still have at least 60 years left, and this can be viewed as an entire lifetime for mortal humans. I've enjoyed sufficient fortune and prosperity in my lifetime, but I've had to face my fair share of hardships as well. I don't owe you or Cyan Gorge Island anything. Lu Jimao didn't answer Zhang Ye's questions, and he suddenly sighed with emotion. If everyone in Bamboo Scroll Lake was like Chen Ping'an, then wouldn't the older generation like us be scolded as having committed far too many crimes to even record? Won't we become detestable sinners who are still revered by many? How would we salvage our reputation? How would we still enjoy power and influence? Island Master, there are few people like Chen Ping'an, Zhang Yi replied with a smile. Lu Jimao turned around and looked at the elderly Dragon Gate tier cultivator, whose soul was already decaying and fading. He looked at him for a long time. Zhang Yi simply remained silent. In the end, Lu Jimao said, Zhang Yi, find an auspicious day at the end of this year to secretly leave Bamboo Scroll Lake. Don't wait until the new year, and make sure to go far away. Find a serene place with good scenery to enjoy the last 60 years of your life. Zhang Yi frowned deeply and asked in puzzlement, has the situation already become this dire? Lu Jimao hesitated for a moment before revealing truthfully, judging from the situation right now, things haven't reached the direst state yet. However, worldly matters are unpredictable, and the Great Li Empire taking over Bamboo Scroll Lake is an inevitability of the unstoppable trend. If the Great Li Empire suddenly becomes stupid one day, or if they suddenly feel like they've conceded too much to Lu Laoqing and want to regain something from me, then Cyan Gorge Island will be targeted at that time. The Great Li Empire will find an excuse to kill me, both satisfying everyone in Bamboo Scroll Lake and also gaining a dozen or so islands in the process. If I were an official of the Great Li Empire, I would 100% do this as well. In fact, I might be starting to sharpen my blade right now. Lu Jimao patted Zhang Ye's shoulder and continued, I'm not trying to win you over or anything. If you weren't Zhang Yi and were instead a mediocre Dragon Gate tier cultivator, then would I regard you with any sense of importance? Would I ramble on for half a day? If I had so much time, wouldn't I cultivate in seclusion instead? After all, what if I accidentally advanced to the unpolished Jade tier? Would the Great Li Empire still dare to sharpen their fucking blade? Would they be willing to execute a loyal servant after they've outlived their usefulness? I would be an unpolished Jade tier cultivator just like Ruan Qiong. Yet Ruan Qiong is almost praised to the high heavens by the Great Li Empire. However, it's a pity that I'm a nascent tier cultivator who's still half a step away from advancing to the unpolished Jade tier. I'm only half a cultivation tier weaker than Ruan Qiong. This is truly infuriating to think about. In any case, you were the one who taught me how to win people over back then. Lu Jimao removed his hand from Zhang Ye's shoulder, helping him fix his collar before smiling and saying, I hope that I'll have at least one old friend who can enjoy a peaceful death. This will take little effort, so there's no need to thank me. Otherwise, you'll be treating me as an outsider. Zhang Yi suddenly let loose a torrent of abuse, scolding, Old bastard, what will I do if I've gone into hiding yet you're genuinely hunted down and killed by the Great Li Empire or Lu Laoqing one day? After 60 years, how will I still catch up to you in the afterlife? How can I still accompany you for a chat? Zhang Yi shook his head and said quietly, I'm not leaving. Lu Jimao looked at the old man who was acting stubborn again, and he changed the topic and said, Now that I think about it, you can become friends with our bookkeeper. When you guys do something smart, you appear so smart that it's as if you're not human. When you guys become stubborn, however, you appear like idiots who were dropped on your head as children. There's something off about your mental state right now, and it's detrimental to your cultivation, Zhang Yi said. In a journey of 100 li, 90 li is only the halfway mark. If your breath of qi becomes deflated now, then it will be incredibly difficult for you to ever summon it again. That being the case, how will you advance to the upper 5 tiers? We've overcome so many hardships and challenges together. So are you not aware of how many opponents who died at our hands were simply lacking that breath of qi? Aha, not bad, Zhang Yi, you've started to lecture me again, Lu Jimao remarked. In fact, you even dare to lecture me about cultivation. Do you seriously think we're still the same naive C-observation tier cultivators as before? Zhang Yi smiled and replied, I could still be regarded as naive when I advanced to the abode tier, and you weren't young either at that time. This can't be helped, since vagrant cultivators like you are no different from wild dogs scavenging for food. Vagrant cultivators like you lead a far more miserable life than official immortals like me. Lu Jimao smiled in ridicule and jabbed. You've lived as a vagrant cultivator for so many years in Bamboo Scroll Lake. Yet in the end, you still prefer to view yourself as an official immortal? There's something that I've always kept to myself and not told anyone else, Zhang Yi murmured. On the first day that I arrived at Bamboo Scroll Lake with that person called Lu Jimao, I dearly hoped that I could one day see Lu Jimao establish a sect at Bamboo Scroll Lake as a vagrant cultivator. So, I've frequently visited a place these past few years, the place where Lu Jimao and I first established ourselves in Bamboo Scroll Lake. This is a small island with the same name as the Hengbo residence, Hengbo Island. It was a very small island, and it was eventually obliterated by the bonded treasure of a golden core tier enemy, whom we viewed as invincible back then. I was angered to death at the time, and I carried the unyielding Lu Jimao on my back as I rode to the ruins where I silently shed tears of pain. Chen Ping'an and Tan Yuanyi arrived at the Hengbo residence at almost exactly the same time. However, one arrived openly and one arrived in secret. Lu Jimao personally walked out and led the bookkeeper who was holding a charcoal basket into a secret room. A room whose walls and floor were surprisingly covered with snowflake coins. Apart from that, there were only 4 straw mats. Millet Grain Island's island master Tan Yuanyi was already sitting on one of the straw mats, resting with his eyes closed. After Lu Jimao and Chen Ping'an walked in together, he opened his eyes and stood up, saying with a smile, "I've heard much about Mr. Chen's impressive deeds." Chen Ping'an posed a strange question, asking, "Island Master Tan, is your colleague at the Green Ripple Pavilion, Li Baozhen, who's currently in the Azure Phoenix Nation, able to learn about the recent events in Bamboo Scroll Lake? We engage in the exchange of critical intelligence every so often," Tan Yuanyi replied. "If Mr. Chen doesn't want to appear in the intelligence reports too many times, I can personally oversee some changes." Chen Ping'an cupped his fists and expressed his thanks. Tan Yuanyi made some polite small talk, saying that Mr. Chen was a mighty figure in the Dragon Spring Prefecture, and was even intimate friends with Wei Bo, the formal god of the Northern Mountain. Everyone in the Green Ripple Pavilion admired him, and was impressed by his deeds. In reality, Chen Ping'an didn't feel any delight or gratitude at all. Instead, he started to feel worried about tonight's secret meeting. Those in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire, especially spies deployed in nations outside the Li Empire, viewed rules and laws with utmost importance. However, Tan Yuanyi's promise to oversee some changes could be viewed as an act of breaking the rules. If he were a vagrant cultivator in Bamboo Scroll Lake, such a promise could naturally be viewed as an act of sincerity and a foundation to engage in further transactions. However, Chen Ping'an was coincidentally someone who was extremely familiar with some certain rules of the Great Li Empire. This couldn't be helped, seeing that one of his mortal enemies had been that imperial concubine, the original leader of the Green Ripple Pavilion. She was the most powerful woman in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. Since Tan Yuanyi dared to break the rules, even if very minor, this signified that he needed to secretly obtain some compensation from Chen Ping'an. This was part of his responsibility as a representative and negotiator of the Great Li Empire. Many friends turned against each other because of money, and it wasn't necessarily the case that one's so-called friends were being ungrateful. One might also be wrong in the sense that one wasn't able to understand the situation properly. As for the notions of sequential order and the magnitude of right and wrong that should be discussed, these were often overlooked due to the influence of emotions. In the end, everyone would be hurt and suffer a negative outcome. The 3 of them sat down together. One was a passing dragon, a head spy of the Great Li Empire. One was a local ruler, a nascent tier cultivator of Bamboo Scroll Lake. One was a passerby, a citizen of the Great Li Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture, and the bookkeeper of Cyan Gorge Island. Chen Ping'an sat cross-legged, placing his hands on his charcoal basket and asking bluntly, "The Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan owes me some gold essence copper coins due to the events that took place in Old Dragon City. Is Island Master Tan aware of this matter?" Tan Yuanyi nodded and replied, "This is a top-level secret in the Green Ripple Pavilion, and of all the hidden spies and pawns we have in the central region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, I'm the only one who can obtain some information about this secret. I'm only aware of bits and pieces that were purposely described in a brief manner in the official documents, and I don't have the right to learn about the finer details. Is the military of the Great Li Empire, for example, the 2 armies of heavy cavalry that arrived on the borders of the luminous Vermilion Empire one after another, very dissatisfied with Island Master Tan?" Chen Ping'an asked. Tan Yuanyi's expression changed slightly. The Great Li Empire respected and promoted martial arts, And this was the case in the imperial court in the cultivation world, and also in the mortal world. It wasn't without reason that the people of the Great Li Empire were said to be tough and physical, and it was also because of this that they were always insulted as northern barbarians by the rest of the eastern treasured vile continent. Most of the pillar clans in the Great Li Empire had their roots in the military, and these pillar clans all controlled armies of heavy cavalry that were very accustomed to warfare. No one clan could completely control the entire army of the nation, and it was oftentimes 2 or 3 powerful clans balancing out or forming alliances with each other. Of course, there were also pillar clans like the Yuan clan and the Chao clan who viewed each other as mortal enemies. If it weren't for Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan, the scholarly officials of the Great Li Empire would have never had the opportunity to shine. In fact, even after Embroidered Tiger had already managed the imperial court for 100 years, the imperial court had still managed to produce a huge joke last year. The messenger of an army engaged in the southward expedition angrily marched over to the Ministry of Revenue to demand silver, and the assistant minister, who was an entire rank above the messenger, personally came out to greet him. The assistant minister followed the normal procedures of the Ministry of Revenue, first complaining about their difficulties and crying poor before spreading his hands apart and saying that they had no silver to spare. If there existed some sort of relationship between the officials, then the Ministry of Revenue would at most say in private that they would try their best to free up some funds. If there existed no relationship, then the officials requesting funds could scram and do whatever they wanted. If they were capable enough, then they were free to cause trouble at the Ministry of Revenue. The messenger requesting silver from the Ministry of Revenue belonged to the latter group of officials who had no meaningful relationship with the ministry, so after enduring the excuses and listening for half a day, he finally exploded in anger and slammed the table, glaring at the assistant minister and pointing at his nose as he unleashed a torrent of abuse. The messenger clearly listed out the contributions made by the army he belonged to, going through a list of enemy nations that they had defeated and conquered. Afterward, he recounted the bloody battles that the army had experienced, announcing the specific battle and nation and stating the number of casualties they had suffered. According to what Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan had said before, this was a case of martial artists also needing to speak in a refined manner that scholarly officials could understand. In the end, the messenger asked the assistant minister if his conscience had been eaten by a dog, what with his mumbling speech and a myriad of excuses to avoid handing out pay for the soldiers. He then clearly revealed how many funds the Ministry of Revenue still had, going to such lengths that the assistant minister eventually sighed with emotion and remarked that the messenger should become an official in the Ministry of Revenue instead. After all the back and forth, the messenger naturally returned with a healthy sum of silver. Not only that, but he was also given a pleasant surprise, with the assistant minister giving an additional sum of money to the army that had complex relationships in the capital. However, before the messenger could leave the capital and deliver the good news, he was quickly summoned back along with the assistant minister and even the superior of the latter, the head minister, who was regarded as the god of wealth of the Great Li Empire. The 3 of them were gathered together in a large hall. Sitting on the main seat was Embroidered Tiger, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan of the Great Li Empire. At the time, Cui Chan had sipped some tea and said with a faint smile, "The Ministry of Revenue doesn't feel ashamed to delay payment to the teachers and poor scholars of the Great Li Empire? Didn't you officials also start off as scholars? If I remember correctly, Right-hand Assistant Minister Song Yen of the Ministry of Revenue also received his earliest education in a village school. Can you truly bring yourself to hold back these funds? Has the Great Li Empire already become so impoverished?" Ignoring the assistant minister, who was shaking in fear, Cui Chan then turned to the white-haired yet hale and hearty head minister and said, "God of Wealth Han, who should we blame for the Great Li Empire becoming so poor? Should we blame me? Or should we blame you?" The elderly head minister was surprisingly unafraid, and he pointed at Song Yen and replied, "I wouldn't dare to blame Imperial Preceptor. I might be old, but I'm even more obsessed with holding my official post. In any case, the Ministry of Revenue isn't poor at all. We have large amounts of silver, and it's just that we're unwilling to spend them irresponsibly. In this sense, I'm not to blame either, and only Song Yen can be blamed for this incident. From the beginning to the end, the Ministry of Revenue abided by Imperial Preceptor's request when moving those funds. We did everything in a clean and tidy manner. not giving one more copper coin and not giving one less copper coin. However, Song Yan's actions led to the resulting incident. One should have the courage to bear responsibility for one's own actions. So Song Yan, hurry up and display the backbone and integrity of an official from the Ministry of Revenue. The messenger who had asked for funds widened his eyes in shock. This was the conduct of a high-ranking official in the 6 ministries. He didn't seem any better than the unrefined soldiers from the army. By the looks of it, all of the shameless people and shameless excuses in the world were actually the same. Cui Chan took a sip of tea and smiled at the elderly head minister, saying, "All right, stop beating around the bush and trying to plead for your subordinate. Song Yan's mistake is indeed quite big, but it isn't so big that he'll lose his official position. He did quite well during the past few official evaluations, so his punishment will be to give up 3 years of pay and add it to that fund." Song Yan was going weak at the knees, and he felt a great sense of relief upon hearing this, saying, "This subordinate is willing to give up 10 years of his pay." The elderly head minister slapped his forehead and lamented, "Foolish idiot, you're seeking death now." Cui Chan didn't become angry, and he held his cup of tea in one hand and waved his other hand with the cup lid at Song Yan, saying, "This isn't a proposal befitting of officials. When you go back and return to your senses, calm down and diligently learn the way of officials from your head minister. Stop deluding yourself with the thought that your superior only established himself in the core of the imperial court thanks to his ability to make money." The elderly head minister left the hall with his assistant minister, who had just experienced a close brush with death. The two of them wiped away their sweat together, and the elderly head minister kicked Song Yan on the leg and scolded in a low voice, "If I were 30 or 40 years younger, I would have kicked you until you shat your pants." Assistant Minister Song Yan smiled bitterly in response. Was this still the same head minister who always appeared so refined and scholarly?